The protagonist, with blurred vision, looks down and says that everything there was red. With a blade in his chest and labored breathing, he mentions that all that remained in that place was death. As he questions why so much blood was necessary, he looks back and sees one of his comrades dead. Both his brother Jaemin, his friends, and the disciples, all of them were now dead in that place. The alliance of 20 sects, made up of the most powerful people, had been created for the final battle against Chiama. However, the result of it all was the annihilation of both sides. And the reason for all this was the man sitting atop the pile of bodies, the demon who descended from the heavens and bathed the land in blood, the leader of the demonic cult known as Chinama. Hyama calls out to the disciple of the Manhwa sect and says it's a pity he finds himself in this situation. The protagonist stares at him and begins to rise, spitting blood as Chinama remarks that even though he survived this battle, the life of glory and fame he had hoped for after this would not be possible. After all, it was clear to both of them that their day had come. The protagonist tells him to shut up. However, from atop the pile of bodies, Chiama extends his arm and says that he can feel proud of this. Though many had helped him in this final battle, it was his blade that delivered the final blow, and as the leader of the demonic cult, he recognizes the blade of Mount Hoa as the most powerful on Earth. The protagonist yells and tells him to shut up once more. He charges toward the demon, who remarks that it's a shame because with one more day, he would have been worthy of the name Chinama. However, he says that this doesn't matter and tells the Mount Hoa disciple to remember, this was not the end. The demonic forces would return, and when that day came, the world would fall under the control of the demonic cult. The protagonist extends his sword as Chinama declares that when that happens, he will be unstoppable. A slash cuts through, and a line appears on the demon's neck. He evaporates, and his head rolls down the pile of bodies. Atop it all, the protagonist declares that the war has finally ended. However, he already knew that his life had also come to an end. What he wanted to know was what would happen now to Mount Hoa. All the most powerful members who had participated in this advance were dead. The only people left in that sect were children who barely knew how to hold a sword. He couldn't even tell if all this bloodshed had been worth anything in the end. He wonders if, had he trained a bit more, he might have been able to save at least one of them. But that no longer mattered. Lying atop the pile, he says that in the end, it was all in vain. Even the brightest peels eventually rot. The protagonist was the 13th disciple of Mount Hoa and the strongest swordsman on Earth, known as the Master of the Blossoming Blade, Changmayan. He had finally managed to take the life of the demon who brought catastrophe to the land. But in the end, he died atop the 100,000 mountain peaks. That was the legacy he should have left on Earth. Before it all happened, a baby had been abandoned in front of Mount Hoa. Two elderly people approached and picked him up from the ground. Sometime later, he was practicing swordsmanship. One of the teachers calls out to Changmayan, while his consciousness questions what those visions were. The teacher scolds him, saying that for someone training in martial arts, he should follow the correct path and not resort to violence. At the time, he felt somewhat angry as he was always getting scolded. The truth is, even though he was a member of the sect, he didn't take the teachings to heart. Even though he had earned the title of Swordmaster, he should never have forgotten that in the end, he wouldn't have anything in this life if it weren't for Mount Hoa. One of the sect masters asks if he has any regrets. Unconscious within his own mind, Changmayan says yes. He had countless regrets and wished he had followed the teachings of the sect more closely. Maybe that way he would have become an even stronger warrior and somehow changed the outcome of this terrible situation. However, Jaemin speaks up and says that he didn't need to have regrets because all of this was part of the destiny of the Mount Hoa sect, and he was sure they would continue to exist. The scene then shifts to a boy getting hit on the head. Inside a tent, an argument is taking place. A boy tries to defend himself from the attack, asking where Chinama is. The person in front of him asks what business he has with Chinama. The boy, with a wooden stick on his back, says he doesn't know who this Chinama is and claims to be a stinking street rat. Everyone was demanding money, but there he was sleeping as if he owned the place. The boy was utterly confused, wanting to know what was happening because it seemed like there was a beggar in front of him threatening him. The boy, who had woken up, tells the guy to put down that stick before he gets a beating. However, the guy starts laughing, leaving him desperate as the boy on the ground begins to lose patience. Saying that, as far as he knows, not even the leader of the beggar's sect should treat him like that, the boy raises his arm and says that now he's screwed. The protagonist then stretches out his hand, saying he'll have to teach this guy a lesson. But then he notices something strange. The wooden stick comes down, and while he's wondering why the arm is so small, he realizes he won't be able to block it and gets hit on the head again. The guy mocks him, calling him shameless, and starts hitting him repeatedly. At this point, another person was getting involved in the fight, but upon seeing the beating, they decided to leave. Sometime later, the boy was sitting by a river with a bleeding nose, saying he hadn't been beaten this badly, even when he was at Mount Hoa. However, one day he'd get back at that bastard. Then he falls silent and looks down, wondering who that child in the water's reflection was. It seemed like one of those reincarnation things Buddhists believe in. While he ponders that, if this were true, he should have reincarnated into Mount Shaolin. Someone appears behind him. The boy calls out to him, and Changmayan says he saw him watching the fight and running away afterward. The boy apologizes and says Wangshou is sometimes like that, but today he went too far. But suddenly, the protagonist raises a finger and says he's going to ask a question. Actually, not just one, he's going to ask 2 questions. They stare at each other, the boy confused. Silence fills the air and Chong Mayong asks if he is a beggar. The boy replies that it's obvious. Just look at the clothes he's wearing. Chong Mayong crouches down in anger, asking what kind of cursed reincarnation this is. He then stands up and says he's going to the second question. He mentions the name Chianma and asks if the boy knows who that it is. The boy responds that it seems like the beating was strong enough to make him go crazy. Chong Mayong demands he answer the question. The boy crosses his arms and says he's heard the name. As far as he knows, that was the great leader of the demonic clan who died 100 years ago. Chong Mayong is shocked and wonders what kind of story this is about something that happened 100 years ago. He grabs the boy by the collar and asks if that's true. Hesitant, the boy asks why he would lie about something so stupid. The protagonist lets go of him, unable to believe that 100 years have passed. Apparently, he was reborn, but long after his own death. In a way, it was as if he had returned to a world where he was alone. As he's feeling disheartened, the boy asks if he's okay. That's when Chong Mayong remembers Manhwa. He then says the sect's name and asks what happened to it. The boy is puzzled and asks what Manhwa is. Chong Mayong becomes even more alarmed. He asks if the boy is a beggar, who replies that he certainly is. Chong Mayong says that beggars should belong to the Gaibang sect, so how come he doesn't know about Manhwa, one of the 10 greatest sects in the world? The boy is confused and asks what nonsense he's talking about. He lists the names of the 10 great sects and says none of them are called Manhwa. Chong Mayong wonders how this is possible. How did the sect he had raised to the top of the world vanish from the map? He grabs the boy by the collar again, and the boy wonders if it's going to happen again. The protagonist shakes him, demanding to know how these weak sects became among the 10 strongest in the world and how Mount Huo could have disappeared in the meantime. The boy, shaken, starts to recall the name. Then he says he's heard there's a sect like that in the Shaanxi region. Chong Mayong gets excited, but the boy says that as far as he knows, it's not one of the 10 strongest. Chong Mayong becomes pensive and says that as far as he remembers, that sect is in ruins. The poor protagonist is in disbelief. How could Mount Huo, one of the most renowned sects in the world, have disappeared like that? He then lets go of the boy and slowly says that to believe this, he'll have to go there and see for himself. He then clenches his fists and says he's heading to Mount Huo. The boy finds it amusing and tells him he'd better return to the streets to beg or he'll starve to death. Chong Mayong, however, tells him to shut up and says he'll have to answer many questions, so it's best not to lie. He then beats his chest and asks the name of this boy. The boy stands up and asks what kind of beggar has a name. People call him Chosang, but whatever. He then asks his age and the boy again replies, who knows the age of a beggar? Chong Mayong says that's fine. He just wants to know now the name of the boy who beat him. The boy introduces himself as Gucho and says the leader's name was Zhongpao. Chong Mayong then says that good deeds will be repaid doubly, but vengeance always comes back tenfold. He then tells him to remember the name Chong Mayong from the Mount Hua sect because one day he'll pay for this kindness. He starts to leave, saying that now he's going, but then he quickly returns and asks which direction Mount Hua is. A second later, birds fly off as he races through the forest. The problem is, he's getting exhausted while remembering that in his past life, he was faster than a horse. After pushing himself, he collapses on the ground like an idiot, his heart nearly exploding. This Dan child's body couldn't keep moving for even 15 minutes. At this rate, he'll die before he even gets close to Mount Hua. With his face buried in the ground, he wonders how he's going to reach the Shaanxi sect. He then starts to smile and says that it's time to use the great intellect of Master Chong Mayong. Now he's excited, saying that this is an incredible opportunity. Even those who reach the peak of mastery have many regrets. One of his was because he was always lazy when he was younger. He never listened to the elders and was always dragged to the training grounds because all he wanted to do was escape. Besides that, he used to steal his teachers' drinks, which made them furious with him. However, that was something he didn't intend to change in this life. He then heads toward a tree, saying that in the end, it's just about starting over. First, he needed a place without distractions, and this seemed to be good enough. He sits in front of the tree while trying to remember what the right technique for this situation would be. He knew countless ways to increase his energy, and many others went beyond the knowledge of Mount Hua. However, he wasn't sure which one was best to learn first. Then he remembers a technique called the 6 elements, a cheap text sold for 5 coins in street shops, known for being of poor quality. However, it was anything but a bad technique. The 6 elements was the first thing the disciples of Mount Hua learned. It wasn't extraordinary in any way, but it allowed the practitioner's body to be purified. It was a fundamental technique for those who were in no rush, perfect for someone looking to build an extremely solid foundation. Slowly, he begins gathering energy in his body. The strange roots rise through him as he manages to purify the sky. Little by little, he gathers this purified energy in the center of his body. That small point of power was the beginning of his entire journey in this life. He then stands up, saying that this seed will be the beginning to create the unstoppable avalanche. But as he stands, he collapses to the ground like an idiot, realizing that he spent all the energy he had just to do that. He remembers Brother Jamin always saying that his problem was not using his head properly. Lying on the ground, he wonders how he'll make it to Mount Hua at this pace. The scene shifts to a bustling city. The boys run into an alley and call for their brother, warning him that there's another beggar asking for money, so they're running out of coins. It was a very young boy, and everyone was giving him money because of it. The Mohawk guy stands up, saying he'll have to show how things work in this area. The guy gets excited and tells everyone to follow. A little later, a small boy is shown in the corner of a wall eating. Obviously, it was Chang Mayong. The guys shout at him and tell him to stop pretending he doesn't hear them. Our boy looks back and asks if they're talking to him. The Mohawk guy says of course they're since no one else is around and asks if he wants to die. He warns him that he should know he can't beg in other people's territory, so it's better for him to hand over everything he has, including the food in his hand. Chang Mayong looks at his hand and says they're a bunch of greedy scoundrels because they even want what he's already bitten into. The guys crack their knuckles, saying he deserves a lesson. However, Chang Mayong just stands up, throws a small punch, and says he's fine. He looks at the guys and warns them that he's not very strong yet, but it's enough. He had already gotten used to this body and didn't have time to waste, so they should all come at him at once. The beggar almost explodes with rage, saying he had thought about going easy on him. But he changes his mind and tells everyone to finish off the kid. The first one stretches out his arm to throw a punch, but Chang Mayong easily dodges. He looks at him, clenches his fist, and hits him on the cheek. The guy flies away, and our boy asks if they know who he is. He is the master of the blossoming blade known as Chang Mayong of the Great Mount Hua sect. With that, the fight ensues, and after some time, they end up apologizing. Our boy tells them not to call him sir because he's just a beggar too. The guy calls him a beggar, and our boy asks what kind of disrespect that is. After a while, he says whatever and asks what the fastest way to Shanxi is. The guy says that's an easy question, but if they were smart, they wouldn't be begging on the streets. Chang Mayong laughs, saying that makes total sense. They all laugh at each other until he grabs him by the collar and tells him that the next time they meet, he better have learned some geography of this place. If, in the future, he asks something and doesn't know the answer, he'll suffer a lot of pain. At that moment, the beggars all run off as Chang Mayong tells them to scram. The scene shifts to the sunset between the mountains. An old man observes the landscape when someone calls for the sect leader. The person introduces himself as Yunem, and the leader tells him to come in. He appears, apologizing, but says that there's a child wanting to see the leader. The man is confused, but looks to see who's asking for him. He said his name was Chang Mayong, and his desire was to join the Mount Hua sect. The old man seemed very confused by the boy's request and asks Unem if he didn't tell the child that they weren't accepting any more disciples. Unem replies that he did, but the boy desperately insisted on seeing the leader. Our Chang Mayong stood there with a smile on his face, but the truth is he was dying of anger over what had just happened. A little earlier, he had finally reached the entrance to Mount Hua. Those damn beggars had given him a useless shortcut, but in the end, he managed to find it. Now the hardest part was beginning, climbing to the sect. He climbed the stairs, scaled the mud, and then had to climb the mountain. It was a path he had taken countless times before, but now, with this body, it wasn't easy at all. Yet he was determined and he finally reached the top of Mount Hua. However, he was met with something that left him confused. In front of the sect, there wasn't even a sign with the name of the place. He remembered that Brother Chang Mayong used to clean that cursed name every morning. He had barely arrived and already couldn't believe the state of the sect. Just then, the door begins to open and someone asks who he is. It was Humam, who found it strange that a child had shown up there. He immediately wanted to know how he managed to climb the mountain on his own. The protagonist ignores the question and says he wanted to know something. Was the man standing in front of him a disciple of the Mount Hua sect? The man replies that he was, and our boy is excited that they weren't completely extinct. The man then says he can come in if he wants, and our boy is a bit confused. Anim explains that they don't accept visitors, but it's too late for him to climb back down the mountain. At least he would have a place to stay since the nights in the region were cold. But the moment he stepped inside, he was shocked by what he saw. The training ground, once an incredible marble arena, was now just a bare field. Lunam asks what's wrong, and smiling, he says he's just admiring the incredible training area of this sect. But when he looks to the side, he sees something else that doesn't make sense. The Palace of the Heavens, a building that used to be right next door, had also disappeared. Playing dumb, he remarks how strange it was to have a staircase leading nowhere and asks what happened. Anam explains that the elders say there used to be a palace in that spot long ago. Chang Mayong thinks to himself that he knows there was a palace. He wants to know how it disappeared. Hanem says a child wouldn't understand, but the disappearance was like a glorious battle scar. Our boy remarks to himself that there's nothing glorious about it. The elder asks what he said, and he replies, nothing. With that, Hanem leads the way, saying he'll show him where he'll be staying. As they walk, Chang Mayong thinks that it must have been difficult to keep the sect going all these years. They arrive at the Jade Temple, and our boy is relieved that at least that was still intact. Hanem begins to open the door and says that at Mount Hua, they follow the path of righteousness. That's why first, he must show respect to those who came before him. However, as soon as he steps inside, he's shocked again. Two things that were supposed to be here had vanished. A candle and a golden pot gifted by Emperor Jin, as well as a handmade scroll from the ancestors and a golden dragon piece. but now all the treasures of that place had disappeared. He gets closer and wonders if there wasn't supposed to be a flower there. Funham is confused and asks how he knows that. He becomes thoughtful and says there really used to be a cherry blossom made of metal in that spot. Excited, Chang Mayong then wants to know what happened to it. Funham says of course they sold it. It wasn't useful for anything and it didn't fit with the aesthetics of the place. So when a merchant made a good offer, they sold it. The protagonist remembers Jaemin and says, unfortunately, this was the end of the Manhwa sect. The petal of the night-blooming fragrance had disappeared along with all the treasures of the sect. And the worst part was that the idiots in this place had sold something like that for money. Funham approaches and asks if he's alright, while Chang Mayong tells himself he has to fix this mess as soon as possible. At that moment, he kneels down and says he has a request. He wanted to become a disciple of the Manhwa sect. Returning to the present, the sect leader asks why he wants to join and if he knows what kind of place this is. Our boy just says yes, he knows. He's certain it won't be easy to be accepted. But he already knows exactly what he's going to tell him. He remembers a member named Jiang Jing who disappeared during the war. He's going to say that this man was found on the mountain by someone passing by. The man saved him, and as a token of gratitude, he taught him the martial techniques of Manhwa. And he, Chang Mayong, is a descendant of the man who saved him. With that story, he would be a direct disciple of one of the sect's great members, putting him on equal standing with the leader. This was because he didn't want to start from scratch in this place, so he was eager to be rejected and tell his little story. However, the leader says he accepts and he doesn't reject him. At that moment, the protagonist is a bit confused. He asks why, and the old man says he seems eager to join, so how could he refuse? Funham says that's strange because they haven't been accepting new members, but the elder says he's changed his mind. Destiny, for him, worked in mysterious ways. Chang Mayong is wondering why this old man isn't suspicious of him, a complete stranger. However, the elder simply says that regardless of the intent, the boy seems to have come to Manhwa for a reason. They never refused a bird seeking shelter from the rain and always shared their food in winter, so they could never reject a child in this situation. He then tells him to show the boy the beginner's room and begin the ceremony. But Chang Mayong wasn't happy about this at all. In this way, his incredible position in the sect had just been destroyed. The next scene shows him wearing the robe, a uniform for third-grade disciples. But looking around, he wonders why he's in one of the rooms that used to be used for rituals. It didn't seem like just a temporary place. In the old Manhwa, it wasn't like this, as disciples would receive a mentor and go live with them. He walks around trying to understand the place better when someone shouts, asking who he is. The protagonist turns around and a boy appears, asking why he was spying on other people's rooms and if he was some kind of bandit. Suddenly, other disciples start appearing and someone asks Jill what's going on. He says he caught this kid snooping around the senior brother's room, while our protagonist wonders why he always ends up in strange situations like this. Out of nowhere, another person shows up and asks what all the noise is about and why they're causing a ruckus in the dormitory when they should be busy training. Everyone immediately bows and apologizes to the great brother. The guy asks our protagonist who he is, to which he responds that he's Chang Mayong. The man says he'd heard that a new novice was coming and tells him to rest for now. But tomorrow, he'll have to train hard. With that, he tells everyone to rest, and they all shout in agreement. Jill glances back and gives Chang Mayong a cold stare, warning him that he'll see him later to teach him some manners. Chang Mayong is flustered, thinking that these damn juniors needed someone to look after them. He intended to take care of all of them in a warm manner, but that was their problem. The scene then shifts to Jill telling him to take off his robe. Our boy asks what he's talking about, and Jill repeats that he wants him to take off all his clothes. He was about to suffer some humiliation and get involved in a fight, as that was the initiation ritual there. The protagonist remains silent for a moment and then says he wants to ask something first. He wanted to know if senior brother Anjo knew about all of this. Jill responds that the senior brother doesn't come at night and asks if he's looking for a beating to start obeying. Our boy then simply calls out to senior brother and tells him to clench his jaw. When Jill is about to ask why, a punch is already flying toward his face. The other disciples look stunned as Jill is left hanging from the ceiling. The protagonist asks what's the deal with beating him to teach him a lesson and warns that's exactly what he's going to do. With that, a brawl breaks out in the sect. The scene then shifts to him calling for senior brother Anjum, telling him to give him a proper massage, while Anjum apologizes, saying he'll do his best. He then calls for Jo Jill and tells him to stop trembling and come closer. He has some questions to ask since he's new to the sect, and the boy says he'll answer everything. Our boy wants to know what happened to the Golden Palace and why the Manhwa sect went bankrupt. Jo Jill says he'll explain and asks if he's heard of the Master of the Blossoming Blade. Chang Mayong says yes, because after all, that's him. The boy then explains that this is what all the senior brothers talk about. The Master of the Blossoming Blade was the one who killed John Man, the leader of the demonic cult. After the leader's death, the remaining members of the demonic cult decided to attack Manhwa. The sect was completely destroyed and hasn't recovered to this day. Chang Mayong is shocked and wonders if his failure in that battle was what led to the entire Manhwa sect being destroyed. We then see a flashback of a conversation between Chang Mayong and the sect leader. First, they discussed some techniques, and Chong Mayong suggested throwing them out because they were useless. Jaemin stared at him and said it was a good idea, and they continued talking. A little later during the discussion, Jaemin mentioned that it wasn't just for that reason that he had called Chong Mayong. He then said he believed it was time for Chong Mayong to accept an apprentice. He asked how he would manage to teach his techniques to a first disciple. Chong Mayong clenched his fists and said that would be easy. He would beat the boy until he learned. Eventually, after being beaten enough, he would start to understand something. After that, Jaemin never mentioned the idea of him taking an apprentice again. At that moment, someone calls him Senior Brother Junior. From his bed, he tells them not to be so formal and just call him Junior Brother. Then they inform him that Senior Brother Unjam wants to see everyone at the training field soon. Everyone is outside with their swords in hand. Unjam tells them to raise their swords and deliver the first strike. They all perform the first strike, while on the side, Nam stands with Chong Mayong, observing everything. However, our boy looks confused and asks what they call that technique. Nam says the name of the technique is the True Six Elements Sword Technique. It was a basic blade skill considered the foundation of all techniques in Manhwa. But of course, Chong Mayong knew that this was far from being the foundation of Manhwa. They were trying to teach philosophy to someone who didn't even know the alphabet. This type of training would give them a quick advantage for a short period. But what was a true martial artist without a solid foundation? And even worse, the person demonstrating the technique wasn't doing it correctly. He raises his head and looks at the sky, seeing that it was clear and empty, just like the future of Manhwa. He didn't even know where to start fixing something like this. He then calls to the boy beside him, who jumps in surprise and asks what it is. Chong Mayong wants to know what else they're learning in this place. The boy explains that after this technique, they would learn the sword technique of the 7 sages, and after that, they'd move on to the Blossom Hall and study the clarity of the sword technique. Chong Mayong doesn't seem excited about any of this. The boy continues, saying that after that, they would learn the pinnacle of Mount Hua's martial arts, the Great Sword Pacification Technique. However, our boy remembers that Chong Mayong had kept that technique a secret because it wasn't effective enough. It was exactly the technique that he had told them to discard and remove from the library. But now, the trash he had ordered to be thrown away was being considered the pinnacle of this place. He wanted to know what had happened to the Plum Blossom technique of 24 strikes. The instructor continues scolding them, telling them to take the training seriously. The scene then shifts to nighttime and our boy calls for Brother Jiel. Jiel asks what it is, and our boy says he already told him to relax. He then says he has a favor to ask and tells Jiel to gather everyone at 5 a.m. in the training hall. Besides that, there were a few things he needed to prepare. He starts listing some items, saying he wants 5 of them for each person. A little while later, Jiel asks if he's sure about this. Chong Mayong just smiles and asks if Jiel thinks he won't be able to do it. Of course, the boy says he can manage it without any problem. Our boy then tells him to go and says how much he loves how helpful he is. But our protagonist remains there thinking. At the moment, Mount Hua had no money, no techniques, and no talent. No one in the world would be surprised if they closed down tomorrow. And right now, the only thing he can contribute is talent. The problem is that the third-class disciples are far from being extraordinary martial artists. However, in the end, a great sect isn't built in a day. He's going to have to use these amateurs to restore Mount Hua to its former glory. Everyone sleeps and wakes up at 5 a.m. Naturally, they're all angry, wanting to know why they're following the orders of that Dan Jr. They ask the seniors how long this was going to keep happening. The two think to themselves that everyone knows they all got beaten. Just then, our boy shows up and asks if anyone was talking about him. Everyone is immediately startled at the sight of him. However, one of them gathers the courage to ask who he thinks he is to gather everyone there at 5 a.m. Our boy stays silent for a second and tells the brothers not to be so mad. He then apologizes and says that he really forgot to consider everyone's feelings. He personally wanted to apologize so maybe they could talk a little inside. He leads everyone who didn't feel like training into a room and closes the door. Outside, the others are confused about what's happening. Then suddenly, the whole house begins to shake. Jiel noticed the movement. It seemed sudden, but it was clear something was happening. A second later, everyone comes running out terrified. They form a line and Chong Mayong says that now they seem motivated. He then announces that starting that day, physical training would begin at 5 a.m. for everyone. He calls them all useless senior brothers. The sun begins to rise. Lenin wakes up in his room and wonders why none of the disciples had come to greet him. This could only mean that everyone was still asleep. It was probably because of the new disciple. They must have been fooling around all night. He steps out of his room, saying he'll have to teach everyone a lesson. He thought Yeonjong would keep the place in order, but apparently not. That's when he gets confused. Everyone is exhausted and collapsed on the ground. He wants to know why all those kids look like a bunch of old men. Immediately, he shouts, asking what happened there and what all this mess was about. The people stare at each other, and one M realizes they're hesitating to answer his question. Who had left them so scared that they were even afraid to respond to him? The scariest part, however, was that Jo Jiel was also lying there, completely worn out. But right in front of him was the new member. Chong Mayong was there, squatting with 2 giant rocks. He exhales and lifts them again. He had already done 10,065 repetitions. That's when our boy, exhausted, also notices Yunem's presence. He greets him with a good morning, while Yunem watches, not understanding what's happening. He could see that the boy was on the verge of exhaustion, but for some reason, he managed to stay standing. He immediately orders someone to fetch water, but Chang Mayong says he's fine. He drinks a little, and then Unam tells him to tell the truth. What happened in that place? The protagonist says it was nothing serious. They just woke up a little earlier to do a bit of training. And strangely, everyone was so motivated that they decided to stay a little longer. Unam finds it odd that these lazy disciples were so eager to train. But when he looks back, he sees that the guys were afraid, and he soon realizes that the reason for all this was Chang Mayong. How could they call themselves disciples of the Manhwa sect when they were being beaten by a child like him? He should give him a little lesson. He then tells our boy that the White Blossom Hall also has its own rules and asks who gave them permission to sleep less and wake up early to train. With a clueless expression, Chang Mayong says that if that's the case, they'll stop training then. Unam is confused by this reaction. He needed to make it clear that this damn kid had threatened his seniors. He looks at our boy, who seemed all innocent. He didn't know how to handle this because it would make everyone in the Manhwa sect look like fools. He'd have to make it clear to everyone that this kid who had arrived yesterday had beaten up all the third-class disciples, which would make the teachers look like the biggest fools. While he didn't know what to say, Chang Mayong asks for 1 month. That's all if he wanted to train with everyone. In that time, he guaranteed they'd see an incredible difference. Besides, he was only proposing this because the seniors seemed strangely motivated. They had been training hard, yet no one had complained. He shouts if everyone agrees, and the others simply say yes. At that moment, Unam realizes that the boy had somehow made sure no one told the truth. But where did they find a kid like this? As soon as he arrived, he had already dominated all the third-class disciples and was even making them train. Unam then says the training must also be difficult for him, so why was he so eager to wake up early and train? Chang Mayong replies that although they can learn a lot, they can still push themselves harder to improve faster. Every minute spent in bed is a minute less spent training. With those words, Unam understood that the boy meant that no one needed a reason to train harder. He then asked the boy what the most important part of the relationship with older brothers is. Our boy says it's respect, of course, and swears he will always obey the commands of the senior brothers. The leader is starting to realize that the boy is smart and won't want to humiliate him in any way to maintain the hierarchy of the place. Unfortunately, he admits that the boy is clever. He then turns around, shouting to everyone how amazing it was that they had volunteered to train so early. He was extremely impressed with everyone. If they kept training like that, he was sure they'd become stronger than ever. However, that wasn't what the group was hoping for, and they asked for help. But Unam runs off immediately, leaving them behind. Chang Mayong tightens his fist and asks what kind of help they were asking for. How could they dare to say something like that when it was clear he wasn't there to harm anyone? He then asks if they could have another conversation inside. In the next scene, they are already getting beaten up. Several days pass in the sect. Our protagonist continues practicing. His energy center was still weak and small, but it was finally starting to form. During this time, he's also learning more and more about what happened to Manhwa. The reason the dormitory system had been created was because they no longer had enough trainers. Moreover, the sect leader and the 2 masters were very kind people. They had great intentions, but they were incredibly weak. Their strength was pathetic compared to even a disciple from the sect 100 years ago. And naturally, as a consequence, the third-class disciples were also terrible. But the question remains, why would that matter? After all, Chang Mayong was here now. Manhwa would rise again as the #1 sect in this land. That was his ultimate goal. The scene shifts to the dining hall. A boy tries to grab some food, but his hand hurts so much that he ends up dropping it. He says that training hard is good, but they at least need the energy to be able to eat. He then tells Jewel to talk to the boy and ask him to go easier on the training. No one has been able to use their chopsticks for days, but Jewel just replies that he doesn't have time to listen to those endless complaints and asks if he's their messenger boy. He says that whoever wants to go against Chang Mayong should speak to him directly. He then stands up and says he wants to talk to Yunjong for a bit. Walking outside, Yunjong comments that he seems relieved by everything. Jill just responds by asking what he thinks about Manhwa. Yunjong is a bit confused and says that's a tough question. Jill says that he could go back to his family anytime, but he knew that Yunjong's goal was to live in this sect. Yunjong agrees, and they both fall silent. Jill then says that before, he thought the Manhwa sect had no future. His friend says that's a crazy thing to say and shouldn't be mentioned to anyone. However, Jill says his mind has changed. The future he saw for the sect had shifted since Chang Mayong's arrival. Even though it was forced, he finally understood the importance of those early morning training sessions. He realized that he had never trained so hard to the point of pushing himself to his limits. On the other hand, that kid kept training even harder for longer and didn't seem to get tired. Seeing him so dedicated made Jill want to give his best in this place too. He then turns and says that from today he's going to give 100% of himself to become a true martial artist. Yunjong smiles and says he feels the same way. Meanwhile, our boy was up in a tree, listening to everything, thinking that he had already bagged 2 of them. Their trainer hadn't caused too much trouble either, But the journey was still long. That's when someone bangs on the sect's door, demanding that the leader come out. Chang Mayan is confused while someone yells to open the door immediately. Someone kicks the door and tells one of the disciples to fetch the leader. Before anyone can respond, they start barging into the sect. Unim and Unjun look a bit embarrassed as the men begin invading. From above, Chang Mayan is confused, wondering who these people are. The group says they've been waiting there for a long time and are losing patience. They want to know when they're finally going to be paid back. At that moment, our boy realizes he has yet another problem to solve. He hadn't known these bastards were so deep in debt. He stands in front of the leader's house and asks if he isn't ashamed, demanding that he come out immediately. The door opens and the leader steps outside. Chang Mayan watches from the side, observing everything. The elder greets everyone and asks what brings them there so late at night. Our boy finds it interesting and quickly understands why this man is the new leader. Every movement and word he used had a certain air of wisdom. It was a subtle way of showing that he was clearly trying to stall the conversation with these men. Then the pavilion leader, Munyan Gong, clears his throat and says that it seems the sect leader is doing quite well. The elder responds that he never imagined the great owner of the pavilion would come all the way there. He says it's a shame they have to meet under such circumstances. He regrets having to climb Mount Hua, but hopes they understand why he had to come there. He says the sect leader must be aware of the situation they're in because the date they had promised has long passed. They had favored Mount Hua for a long time and never sought compensation all these years. As promised, they were the most lenient they could be, and for that reason, they were giving them 7 days. If they didn't repay their debts, they would take all of Mount Hua's land. Immediately, someone shouts and everyone looks back. The men apologize, saying that one of the young apprentices shouldn't have had to witness something like this. Later, the group explains to our boy that these people are from the Huan Prefecture. Chang Mayan is lost in thought while the young boy is looking for a chance to escape before he gets beaten again. Jojiel asks if this prefecture is located just below Mount Hua, and the boy confirms. He then asks if that means the merchants of Mount Hua borrowed money from the people in this prefecture. The boy says he has no idea but has heard of Munyan Gong. As far as he knows, he's the owner of the Huan Pavilion, the largest tavern in that city. Our boy recognizes the name of the pavilion and asks if he's the leader of that place. The two boys are shocked and tell him to calm down as they see him cracking his neck. That's because he knows very well that the Taiho Pavilion always belonged to the Mount Hua sect. He grabs the boy by the collar and asks if the people from the pavilion lent money to Mount Hua, and now that they haven't paid it back, they're trying to take the place. The boy just confirms it, but to Chang Mayan, none of this makes sense. First, it's absurd that Mount Hua would borrow money from the pavilion when the pavilion belongs to Mount Hua. Clearly, something went very wrong in the past. He then calls for Jojiel, who's startled. He tells him that thing he mentioned earlier. He wants him to bring it now. Jojiel is confused, but Chang Mayan orders him to bring it immediately. Jojiel runs off, saying he's on it. He brings the robe and asks why he wants it. Our boy then says that the Buddhists have a saying, sometimes to meet Buddha, you must kill him, which means that sometimes you need to go against the virtuous path to find true enlightenment. Now dressed in the robe, he says he's seeking to follow that teaching. The two boys are shocked and ask if he's thinking about leaving the sect. In a second, he's already jumping over the wall. He looks down at the city, and in the middle of the pavilion, some men are laughing, saying that it seems the leader was left speechless. They amuse themselves, saying they've finally given their final ultimatum. Nare Godo says they deserve it, especially since they've already taken more than 100,000 coins from him. They tell Gong that the leader couldn't even respond properly. Gong, smiling, says that even though he's a merchant who loves money, it still saddens him to destroy a place that meant so much to his ancestors. The man in the blue robe says he shouldn't worry about that since the final deadline had already been extended for a long time. He's sure the entire city will appreciate how lenient he's been. Gong just thinks to himself that it must be nice to live life with such a simple mind. No one there knew it, but Mount Hua was still a major influence. That's because the power of the sect didn't lie in its martial arts, but in the legacy it built over the years. It's hard to find anyone in the Shaanxi region who doesn't know the history of that sect. However, little by little, he's been gaining enough strength to finally put an end to them. Like a duck being slowly cooked, the time had come to finish them off. One of the men then asks what Gong is going to do with Mount Hua's location, as it would be easy to sell such a place. The man's name is Zhongzhen Yu, and he suggests it might be smarter if asked for something else as payment. But Gong says that the place has much more value than they can perceive. Even though it was just an abandoned place, it still carried tremendous value. The men don't seem to understand why, and Gong begins to get angry. He then sets his chopsticks down on the table and says that he hadn't planned on revealing his plan so soon. He tells them to think as if they were enemies of Mount Hua. How interested would they be in paying to erase the legacy of that sect? No one had to worry because they would certainly make a huge profit from this investment. One of them stands up and says it's a brilliant plan, adding that they'll have to celebrate Mr. Gong. Later, Zhongzhen is heading home, saying that it was an incredible night. He was going to make a lot of money from the downfall of Mount Hua, and he's certain he can trust Gong. He looks up, searching for the moon, and wonders why it's not in the sky. Meanwhile, Chang Mayan is just watching. Then Zhongzhen stops, seemingly seeing something ahead of him. As his vision clears, it's our boy standing still and telling him to stay very quiet. Jongsun finds it strange that there's such a small and skinny little thief in front of him. What puzzles him more is why the boy is so conspicuous, as if he wants everyone to know he's a thief. Jongsun crosses his arms and says the boy must be thinking of robbing him. But Chong Mayong calmly says he's not interested in money, only in some answers. Jongsun says that normally he doesn't mind helping lost kids, but tonight the boy is out of luck. That's because he's going to have to deal with the friends he brought along, as he already knows how dangerous it is to wander alone at night. Our boy immediately recognizes the men as caravan guards. One of them asks if they should kill the boy, but Jongsun says it's unnecessary since he just wants to ask him a few questions. He turns around hearing the sounds of a fight and says it seems everything's going well. But strangely, there were a lot of fighting noises, and he starts to wonder what's going on. Then he hears a bang behind him. He turns, telling the men to go easier on the boy. But someone apologizes. It's Chong Mayong, who had already taken everyone out. Chong Mayong says he only wanted to talk, but people were being rather impolite. He then tells Jongsun to come closer. Once again, he tells him that if he answers, he won't get beaten, and Jongsun immediately agrees. Chong Mayong grabs him by the collar and says that now they can start with the lesson. He had offered not to give him a beating, but Jongsun refused, so now he's going to take a few hits. But no worries, he'll still be able to talk once it's over. A moment later, the poor man is all swollen, talking nonsense. Chong Mayong warns him that if he doesn't speak properly, he'll get beaten again. He then asks what's the deal with Mount Hu borrowing 100,000 coins, and the man just confirms it's true. Our boy thinks for a moment and draws Jongsun's attention. He knows that if Jongsun sold everything he had, he wouldn't be able to gather 10,000 coins, let alone 100,000. So how did he and this group of merchants from this failing city manage to lend 100,000 coins to Mount Hua? Jongsun says he'll explain how interest works. Basically, even with a small initial debt, they created an incredible snowball effect. Our boy punches him in the head, telling him not to be proud of something like that. He then asks if Jongsun owns the linen shop, and the man confirms it. Chong Mayong wants to know when he bought the shop, and Jongsun looks confused. He explains that the linen shop has belonged to his family for generations. But once again, that makes no sense because the linen shop also belongs to the Mount Hua sect. The truth is, every major business in the Hua Ying prefecture belongs to the sect. That's because the city only grew thanks to the presence of Mount Hua just above the mountain. The sect had entrusted the merchants with managing things, but apparently, these bastards had been stealing everything from them. At that moment, someone calls him a coward. A man appears, calling him a shameless little thief, and orders him to reveal himself. Our boy, however, is confused by this talk of a sneak attack, especially since he had been standing right in front of everyone. He lets go of Jongsun and asks why the man is so interested in knowing who he is. The man says he demands to know the name of anyone before cutting him down with his blade. Chong Mayong just asks if the guy hadn't just been knocked out. The man starts getting angry with this damn kid. He draws his blade and charges toward him, telling him to get ready. Chong Mayong calmly watches. He had much more kai, speed, and physical strength than the man. But did that mean the man was weaker? Of course not, because strength and speed were far from the best way to measure someone's power. Chong Mayong throws the sword into his hand and deflects the attack with his shoulder. The man is utterly confused as Chong Mayong remembers a lifetime's worth of memories with the blossoming blade. If he doesn't have physical strength in a child's body, he just needs to use the opponent's strength as his own. He then redirects the impact back, and the man is thrown far away. At that moment, Chong Mayong extends his arm and draws his blade. A few petals appear around him, and he tells the man he still has a lot to learn. He appears behind the man using the double blossom sword technique. The poor guy falls to the ground, unconscious. But then he hears someone in awe, and he realizes he made a mistake. He had forgotten about Jongsun, who clearly saw him using that technique. And worse, with that dumbstruck expression on his face, maybe he had recognized it. Jongsun then says that these refined attacks, this martial mastery, and that incredible kai, he was sure of something. Startled, our boy thinks it couldn't be that Jongsun had figured it out. And then Jongsun asks if he's a member of the Zhongnan sect. Chong Mayong is momentarily silent, confused, but then agrees, saying that's exactly right. He's a member of the Great Zhongnan sect. Jongsun then says he'll now tell him everything he wants to know, and our boy just thanks him. Back at the sect, Zhang Mu and Yun Zhang are pacing back and forth, wondering why Chong Mayong hadn't returned. Zhang Mu says it was crazy to let him go out like that, but he's sure the boy will come back unless something bad happens to him. Just then, the door starts to open, and Chong Mayong asks if anything happened while he was gone. Zhang, however, says they're the ones who should be asking him what happened for him to disappear like that. He simply responds that it was nothing serious, and that he even made a little extra money. At that moment, he remembers Jongsun asking if he was from the Zhongnan sect. Even though it was good that his identity wasn't discovered, in some way it still stung a bit. Even the signature technique of Mount Hua, the blossoming technique, was mistaken for another sect's technique. Jiul then asks what he was doing out there. Our boy just responds that kids don't need to know. They get angry, saying that he's a kid too. Chong Mayong tells them to gather everyone because they need to train. Jiul is confused, especially since it's nighttime. But our boy tells him to listen up, saying that whether it rains or shines, day or night, or even snows, they wouldn't miss a single day of training. Joel starts getting excited, saying he's looking forward to today's training. He says he'll gather everyone and asks if Chang Mayong is going to join them. But Chang Mayong says not today as he has other things to do. Zhang says they can only train properly when he's around. They could try training alone, but they know that without him there, no one would take it seriously. However, the protagonist simply says he already knows that and tells them to go gather everyone. He then falls onto his bed, wondering what to do next. The situation was complicated as the city merchants were trying to take the place, and the documents that prove Manhua's ownership of the businesses had probably been lost a long time ago when the sect was attacked. He could just invade the city and beat everyone up, but that would only worsen Manhua's reputation, so things couldn't be solved that way. He needed a justification to prove they were the rightful owners of this land. The problem was how to find something like that. He remembers seeing Jiangman filling out the records of who owned those properties, but when he opened the door, Jiangman seemed to be filling out only a few. He finds it strange that there were so few records and is certain that Jiangman must have been hiding them somewhere else. It was impossible that everything Manhua owned could fit on so few sheets of paper. That means there's likely some kind of vault that only the leader can access. He recalls hearing rumors that such a thing existed and the entrance was probably near the leader's house. That place hadn't changed at all since the past, but considering that everyone there was a martial artist, it had to be near the leader's house. However, it was something difficult to locate, and the only way to do so was through an underground base. Apparently, he was going to have to embark on a treasure hunt. He then opens the door and jumps out of his room, apologizing to Jiangman for what he's about to do. He says he won't even touch any of the treasure and will take it straight to the leader, or maybe that's a promise he won't be able to keep. The scene changes to a flash of light in the middle of the mountains. Our boy is lying on the ground, saying he's exhausted. He had underestimated how big the mountain was, searching from place to place, especially using that kind of technique. He concentrates energy into his palms and slams it into the ground. With that, he can feel how the soil resists his energy. He doesn't know exactly where the vault is, but he's sure it's somewhere nearby. However, time passes and he becomes exhausted without finding anything. But still he tries again and again, until suddenly he feels something strange. He sends out another energy impact and grabs the pickaxe, declaring that he's found it. Now all he has to do is dig and uncover this damn treasure. After some time, he finally discovers a concrete ceiling. However, he finds it impossible that the treasure is hidden behind something so easy to break. He pulls out one of the blocks and sees that it's actually a corridor. This was the path to the real vault. But then he hears footsteps. The sect leader is approaching. Jiang Mayong watches silently and realizes the leader already knows the vault's location. The leader arrives in front of the door, and Chang Mayong imagines that this must be the entrance to the vault. However, he only sees the leader with his hand trembling in front of the door. As he observes the leader's hesitation, Chang Mayong finally understands what's happening. The leader wasn't showing the secret of how to open the door. In reality, this was the image of a man who could do nothing. Manhua was on the brink of extinction, and its martial power was steadily diminishing. Running a place that no longer had any resources must have been difficult even for a leader like him. He had to witness, day by day, the place he had dedicated his entire life to slowly fall apart. It was painful to imagine how difficult it had been for him to see this every day. But a leader could never dishearten others, so he had to appear strong for the sake of all the disciples. And that's why this was the only place where he could show a little sadness. A while later, the sun finally rises. Chang Mayong jumps into the tunnel and says that part of this is still his fault. But it wasn't too late yet. First, he had to get through this damn door. He approaches, places his hand on it, and sends out an energy impact. However, it's immediately repelled. He recognizes the material as millennium metal and knows it's impossible to break through with brute force. Now he understands why this sect leader stood there with no hope of opening it. The problem is that he also can't cut through this metal. But then he remembers that Jiangman's K level wasn't enough to do something like this either. If a leader can get in, then there must be another way to open it. Something catches his attention, and he begins to examine the pattern on the door. It's actually sword marks, the pattern of cuts from the 24 blossoming blade technique. He starts to realize that several of Manhua's techniques were blended into it, but he knows that this can only be done with the Violet Dawn Kai. He would need to perform several techniques one after the other with extreme precision. That's how the door is opened. But why did they create it this way? In a way, he understands how it works, but now there's one more problem. How can he use all these techniques? In his past life, it wouldn't have been an issue. Now he's just a weak child. Even though he knows every form of the attack, he doesn't have enough chi or physical strength to execute each cut. He starts adjusting his hair, saying he didn't want to have to do this. He slaps his stomach and says it looks like he's going to have to start a month-long vacation. He would need to use just a bit of this. He then begins to tap into his true innate chi. This was the energy humans are born with and use to sustain their lives. Using this energy was like using a bit of his lifespan, but he had no choice. Suddenly, a purple aura starts surrounding his body. He points his sword, saying he only has one chance. With a single opportunity, he had to open this door. The problem was that many of these techniques he hadn't even tried using with his body. But there was no time to wait as his sky was already being consumed. He then sends out the first cut, spits blood, and says his body is getting heavier, feeling the limits of his energy. But now, he couldn't stop. He uses the first form of the 6 elements, executes the 24 blossoming blade techniques, and says he cannot break the chain. He continues linking one technique to the next, and gradually, stars form on the door. Finally, he collapses to the ground as the entire door shines. He gets up, asking if it worked. If this didn't succeed, there was nothing else he could try. But suddenly, he starts hearing a sound. A wind blows and the door begins to open. However, poor Chong Mayong is just coughing up blood on the floor. Now because of this, he'll have to take it easy for a few months. But this is the kind of thing he has to do if he wants to save the Manhwa sect. The door begins to open and he smiles, saying he's going to take a look at what Jaemin had been hiding. Finally, he's inside and sees 3 shelves. He finds it strange that there were all these books and nothing else. But considering they used Millennium Acid, it's understandable why it's so small. He remembers Jaemin always complaining about finances, so now it's time to see where the money went. He then pulls out the first book and is immediately impressed because it contains everything the sect owns. These were perfect copies of all the official materials. Now those merchants were definitely screwed. However, looking around, he finds it strange that there are only financial books in this entire place. He was hoping to find some money to buy good food and drink some liquor. But since there was none of that, he pulls out another book, saying he'll take a quick look before leaving. He then sees that these are tomes of techniques, and he wonders if the people hadn't already learned them. But that's when he realizes that none of these techniques are currently taught in Manhwa. That's because they were sealed in this place, with no one able to access them. He imagines that Jaemin hesitated to teach these techniques to future generations, which is why he stored them here. Normally, Jaemin was a man filled with inner conflict. The first shelf reflected his responsibilities within the sect, while the second showed the love and compassion he had for everyone. But now Jaemin didn't need to worry because Chong Mayong would restore the sect to its former glory. And after that, they would move forward and surpass what they once were. However, that's when he notices something strange. On the shelf beside him, there was only a peculiar scroll sitting on top. He pulls it down and begins to read. It says that this was meant only for the sect leader. If someone was reading this scroll, it meant that the next leader had already been chosen. Sometimes a few lines said more than countless words could, and for that reason, he decided to leave his thoughts in this book. Although the sect leader holds the title, they don't dictate the future of Manhwa. The new leader must have already realized that the future of the sect is decided by the younger generation within it. The leader's job is to encourage the new members so that they can find the new path for the sect. He pleads with the leader to abandon the burdensome idea that the future depends on them. Manhwa will always remain Manhwa. It's a force and spirit that cannot be led or wielded. And even if the future is full of fortune or disaster, it will simply continue being the same place. But one thing that wouldn't change over the millennia was that they would always need to guide the disciples and fulfill their duties. That was the heavy burden he was leaving for the next leader of Manhwa. Zhang Yun puts the scroll away and thinks that the old man was always like this. However, he's annoyed because there should be much more in this place. He starts to leave, thinking that at least the scriptures would help deal with the merchants, but he decides to wait for a moment. The layout of the place seems a little strange to him. Zhang Yun had a sort of quirk, where even the lamps had to be asymmetrically distant from him. So why was that shelf strangely empty? He leans on it and pulls it upward, saying there's something more to this. He throws it to the side, and that's when the glow appears. There was a hole that he knew there was another secret, and as he descended, it was there that he finally found what he had been searching for, piles and piles of gold bars. Precious weapons hung on the walls, along with mysterious gems and tons of techniques. He's already drooling, saying that now he's finally rich. Meanwhile, back at his house, the new leader sighs, saying that another day has begun. Mornings should bring hope, but he only felt fear and bitterness. There were only 5 days left until the deadline the pavilion owner had given him. But then someone shouts for him at the door. Immediately, the leader rushes over and asks what's going on. Unjum says he can't explain it. It's something he has to see to believe. The leader is startled by this and says it must be an emergency for him to be so agitated. They both run through the forest. On the way, he sees a bunch of disciples collapse in a circle and asks what happened. Unjum simply explains that they were voluntarily doing some new training. The scene shifts to our boy sitting under a tree. They call for Chong Mayong, asking where he's been. At that moment, he appears and says he's right there. The leader is shocked and asks what happened to him for him to look so worn out. Our boy just responds that it's not important and tells him to take a look at something. The elder wonders what could be so urgent, and then he's blinded by the gleam of light as our boy smiles. The property records, the gold bars, and the weapons. Chong Mayong says he found them by coincidence. The leader wants to know how that's possible, but Chong Mayong says he's too tired and needs to sleep. The elder decides to let him go, figuring he can ask later, but he still can't believe there are piles and piles of gold bars in front of him. And even more precious than that appeared to be the items in the box, the property records of Manhwa and the Huan Prefecture. He hesitantly touches the documents, afraid of tearing something and ruining everything, But as he opens them, he's completely relieved, saying that these really are the city's records, and he collapses onto the floor. He then wakes up in bed, saying that he also saw the record of the 7 blossoming blades, and he realizes he had been dreaming like a madman. But then he shouts, asking where the chest came from, and someone confirms it. We then see someone else examining the same records. It's Haiyan Yang, the head of Mount Hua's finances. He confirms that all those records were real. Additionally, there were certificates of authenticity beneath that treasure. Not to mention, all the certificates have been issued by the government, so it would be easy to verify. They could easily use those to reclaim the pavilion at any time they wanted. Plus, the treasure itself was worth over 100,000 coins. The leader feels relieved, saying that they've finally been given a bit of luck. Or perhaps he doesn't fully understand how that strange child has brought so much fortune to this place. It was as if the embodiment of good times was walking around Mount Hua. However, he stands up and says that if these records are indeed real, there's a conversation that needs to happen. He orders them to summon the owners of the properties listed in the book to Mount Hua immediately. A few days later, Gong was climbing the mountain, with everyone asking him to slow down a bit. But he tells them to keep going because this would be the last time they'd have to climb that wretched mountain. Jongsun grumbles, saying he never wants to set foot there again and doesn't want to even look at Mount Hua anymore. The other merchants wonder if the leader called them there because he managed to get the money. But Gong at the front says 100,000 coins aren't so easy to gather. He's sure the leader is going to ask for more leniency because he hasn't been able to raise the money. It was something impossible to do by the deadline they had given, and that's why they called them there. Some call the leader shameless for summoning everyone when he's the one in debt. However, others say that despite the sect's decline, the name of the great Mount Hua still commands respect. Jongsun wonders if they really can't pay, especially considering that a disciple from the Zhongnan sect seemed interested in Mount Hua. If he could get 5,000 gold coins, he'd never have to work again. But as all the merchants arrive in front of the sect, they all feel the same strange uneasiness. It was an unsettling thought to be the ones to sever Mount Hua's future, a sect that had protected the Huayan prefecture for centuries. But they knew this, and together, they walked into the place to collect the inflated debt. Lunan welcomes them all and says the leader is ready to see them, asking them to follow him. The leader then appears, standing face to face with all the merchants. Gong bows and says it's good to see the leader once again. On the other hand, the leader thanks them for making the difficult journey to that place. Gong, ever the false man, says that while they are busy merchants, it must be even harder for him as a leader. The leader chuckles and says they must be exhausted from the climb, asking if they'd like some tea. But Gong interrupts, calling for the leader, and apologizes, saying they're just simple merchants but would like to discuss business first. The leader apologizes for not considering their valuable time and explains that the reason for calling them all here is to update them on Mount Hua's situation. Even though they had sent countless requests for help to everyone they knew, no one was willing to extend a hand to the sect. It was a shame, but despite all their efforts, they wouldn't be able to pay the debt within the time given. Gong stands up and says they've already given Mount Hua enough time. They also have families to feed and can't keep extending the deadline forever. The sect leader says that's precisely why he wanted to speak to everyone. They wouldn't be able to pay the full amount now, but they could at least make a partial payment. He would like to know which of the merchants present would be willing to extend their repayment into the future. He then bows and humbly asks them to show some mercy to Mount Hua. The merchants begin murmuring amongst themselves as some unexpected developments begin to unfold. Our boy is watching everything from afar, commenting that it's an interesting way to handle the situation. He's just not sure whether the leader's words are meant to corner the merchants or if it's the final act of mercy before launching an attack. However, it's clear that sect leader Haiyan Zhang isn't as simple as he seems. A sect leader must have a cold heart and a firm stance. Even though they were all practitioners of Mount Hua, it was still a martial sect, and the leader needed to be able to calculate interests and act accordingly. Zhang Weiyan wanted to see if Haiyan Zhang really had the coldness required of a sect leader. Gong smiles and says he already told him they can't extend the deadline any further. But Haiyan Zhang asks him not to misunderstand his words, as he wasn't just speaking to Gong. He knows Mount Hua owes more than 100,000 coins, but each merchant is an individual with their own portion of that amount. And that's why he wants to know who among them is personally willing to extend their portion for repayment in the future. Gong starts thinking that this damned leader is desperate. He then asks if, should the others say they can't wait any longer, he will be able to pay them all. The leader responds that Mount Hua's reputation has fallen, but they still manage to receive some help and have part of the amount. Of course, they don't have the full 100,000 coins to pay everything. And that's why he asks them to show mercy to Mount Hua and allow them to gradually pay off the debt. Gong is about to say this is out of the question, but Jongsun interrupts and asks if they will be rewarded in any way if they extend the final deadline. The leader says that's correct. Everyone starts murmuring, thinking about whether or not they should extend the deadline. The problem was that they knew it meant taking the risk of never getting their money back. Jongsun then asks why they should do this. The leader takes a deep breath, looks at him, and asks if the name of Mount Hua and the history of that place weren't enough to serve as a guarantee. But Gong chuckles and then bursts out laughing, calling for the sect leader, saying he was asking too much from everyone. The leader remains silent and asks if Gong truly thinks that what he's asking for is too much. If that's the case, he would like to ask something of everyone. He wants to know what Mount Hua represents to each of them. If the name and history of that place don't at least deserve some consideration, who there didn't take the sect's name seriously, and who would dare to disregard all the history they possessed? The sect might have declined, but it had always stood by the prefecture of Huayan. They had always shared Mount Hua's spirit and power with everyone in the city. He wanted to know what Mount Hua represented to each of them and asked them to carefully consider their answer. Gong pauses for a second and then says he has an idea. He points to the side and says that those willing to extend the final deadline should stand over there, but those who want to collect their money today should stand by his side. He then turns around and warns them that each person is responsible for the choices they make, and whoever chooses to extend the deadline will no longer be recognized as a merchant in the union. He then tells them to be smart and make their choice quickly. The merchants begin to think, but no one seems to move. The place falls into complete silence and Gong starts laughing. He asks the leader if he sees that, unfortunately, no one has any pity for that place. But then someone starts walking to the other side. It's Jongsun, and Gong asks where he's going. The leader simply watches. The other merchants want to know what this means. Jongsun just tells them to stop looking at him like that, admitting that he knows he's making a foolish choice. He tells Gong that you would never understand because he's not a native of Huayan Prefecture. Gong had come to this place to take over businesses from others involved with him, and that's why he doesn't understand what Mount Hua means. Everyone born in Huayan grows up hearing stories about Mount Hua. They dream of joining the sect and becoming sword masters, and even after realizing they didn't have martial talent and giving up that dream, they learn about the efforts Mount Hua has made to protect the Shaanxi province. Gong doesn't understand what he's talking about, but Jongsun just says that Gong wouldn't get it anyway. It's something he learned from his father, who learned it from his grandfather. Mount Hua has always been the pride of Huayan and Shaanxi. For Gong, it would be easy to take that money and leave Huayan because he could go to Hamzhou and spend it somewhere else. But Jongsun wasn't going anywhere even if he had the money, because he'd spent his whole life in Huayan. Gong can't believe Jongsun is giving up on making money for the rest of his life because of something like that, and he warns him that he'll regret it. Jongsun recalls that on the way up to Mount Hua, all he could think about was how great it would be to retire rich, and now he was willing to give all that up when he was so close. It was certainly a big mistake, but he had his reasons. He says he's already earned enough money to keep living. If, in the future, he doesn't receive any more money, he'll think of it as a small regret for not taking this chance. But he would forever regret it if he watched Mount Hua collapse today because of a choice he made. Even if he earned enough money to last a lifetime, that kind of life wasn't something he wanted to live. Gong just laughs and tells him to do whatever he wants since, apparently, he's the only one who decided not to get paid. But then someone asks, who said it's just one person? Many other merchants start walking over and stand by Jongsun's side. Gong can't believe it while Hyeonjong watches everything unfold. He lowers his head and says he's fully satisfied to see that so many people still have a meaningful connection to that place. He then tells Vunem to bring it over. At that moment, Onem places a box on the ground containing all the records. From a distance, Gong can already tell they're property records of the prefecture. The leader says that Mount Hua has always shown benevolence to their ancestors for countless generations, but some here have decided to betray them instead of repaying those debts. According to the property records, Mount Hua will assume control of all those businesses, along with all the wealth they had accumulated, down to the last coin. At that moment, the merchants who had decided to stay on the other side were all scared, asking what he was talking about. Why was the leader taking everyone's business like that? However, Hyeonjong simply says that it's exactly as he said. Suddenly, Gong starts laughing and says that this joke has gone too far. The leader then tells Gong that it's shameful for him to think he's there to joke around. At this, Gong closes the book and says he understands. Like he wants to know how they will prove the validity of those accounting books. Once again, the leader questions if he's implying that they forged the authenticity of those books. Gong says he would never imagine that Mount Hua would do something like that. However, they need to be sure they haven't been deceived. The leader remains silent and then says he understands what Gong means by that. So he orders that the finance leader of the agency be brought there. Hyeonjong appears, saying that the authenticity of those books is indeed something that needs to be considered. The damn merchant celebrates, saying that if even the finance guy of this sect said so, then Gong must be right. However, Hyeonjong then turns around and says there's a reason for that. They already anticipated that something like this might happen. That's why half of those books were sent to the prefecture 2 days ago. At that moment, Gong realizes he's in trouble. While they were on their journey to Mount Hua, people were analyzing those books. That means that by now, most of their businesses must already be taken. Not to mention that 2 days is more than enough time for them to complete the whole process. The books at Mount Hua are just a few, while the other half must have already been validated. Gong is about to explode and then shouts at the leader. However, Hyeonjong just tells him to lower his voice, saying that he has no right to shout in that place. True friendship comes from helping others in times of need. However, they have no reason to be merciful to those who betrayed them when they needed them the most. He tells everyone to return to Hua's prefecture because everything will already be resolved. He warns that if it had been done properly, it would have taken everything. However, for each one's work, they would be allowed to take only one cart with a few items. Gong grits his teeth in rage and says he will never forget this. He then turns around while the other merchants just watch. At that moment, Hyeonjong addresses those who did not abandon the sect until the very end. Nothing changes for their business except the fact that it now belongs to Manhwa. They could continue managing it as always and keep the profits. Besides that, he wanted to discuss ways for both sides to profit and benefit everyone. And then he asks everyone to come in. Jongsen, however, knows he's better off than Gong. But even so, he went from being the owner of a shop to now being a simple employee of Manhwa, and he wonders why his grandfather decided to do things this way. However, the scene shifts to Chong Myong, who is furious. He's asking what kind of deal is this about letting them take a cart full of riches. He says this leader is a coward and that he won't let that happen in Manhwa. Already outside the city, Gong and the other merchants are taking their loaded carts. Everyone is fuming with anger. That's because as soon as they reached the city gate, they were greeted by government soldiers. If it hadn't been for the sect leader, they really would have lost everything. And now they are angry with Gong because he made all this happen. They ask Gong how they're going to get out of this. They tell him to stop being silent because everyone trusted his decisions. However, Gong just turns around and asks why he's being blamed for all of this. The fool remains silent for a moment and says that Gong isn't the only one to blame. But then Gong stops. He says there's no reason to be so stressed since they're only in this position temporarily. He's sure those damn books are fake and were forged by the leader. One of the guys in the back, however, says they seem legitimate and have been confirmed by the prefecture. Gong insists, saying they must have set everything up with the prefecture and the representatives there to steal his businesses. However, they would go to the city of Luoyang and talk to the owner there. If the people from this city were using the authorities, they would talk to someone even higher up. But someone appears and says that he's talking nonsense. Boy, it's our guy dressed like a bandit. Gong asks who said that, and our guy coughs, saying that as far as he knows, he's the only one there. But Gong is confused, wondering who this bandit is who walks like an old man. Then he says he knows he wants the riches in the carts, but he better leave quickly, or he'll lose his life for nothing. Our guy hates being underestimated, even more so because to him he's not stealing, he's just taking back what belongs to Manhwa. Gong is confused about what wealth he's talking about, and at that moment he realizes that he belongs to that damned sect. Suddenly, some guys start showing up, and Gong says it's the perfect time to get revenge. A bunch of mercenaries jump toward Chong Myong. However, he looks at them for a second and throws himself at them. The first one finds himself face to face and gets hit on the head with a scabbard, another on the chin, and another on the forehead. In a second, they are all drawn in the sky. He stops in front of Gong and says it's good for him to know. Until today, no one has challenged his words and left with all their limbs intact. Gong is confused as he didn't know that Manhwa still had a martial artist of this level. He orders the useless ones to stand back. Then he tells our boy that he doesn't know where he came from. However, if he had been helping the sect, they wouldn't be in their current state. But it was a pity that he chose the wrong person to come for revenge. And he warns that our boy will die at his hands and be used as a warning to that sect. He activates his energy, saying that the leader will be very sad to know that someone like him died at Gong's hands. He runs toward him, telling him to prepare himself. Chong Myong finds it very suspicious that a shop owner has so much martial energy. However, it's now time to get beaten up everywhere, except in the mouth since he needs to be able to talk afterward. The forest explodes and Gong has his hands on the ground. He's sure he didn't let his guard down and has already faced many practitioners stronger than this guy. It's a common saying that a tiger hunts its best when chasing a mere rabbit. Besides, the moment he saw this masked guy destroy the mercenaries, he didn't lower his guard. Yet even so, this bastard has a bored expression. He moves forward again, saying he's going to fix that face. He stretches out both palms and comes face to face with Chong Myong. However, our boy just stretches out the sword's scabbard and strikes his hand with it. The man stares at his hand as it begins to absorb all his energy. It starts running through his arm and he screams in pain. He had concentrated all of his power, but it was blocked right at the moment of release, and now it's all coming back. Our boy tells him that he's way too slow and recommends he stop trying. At this rate, he's going to break all his fingers before landing a single hit. Gong ignores him, activates power in his foot, and charges toward him. However, our boy seems to turn into a blur and the energy passes through. It explodes in the background and Gong doesn't even know where he ended up. In the same instant, our boy is already behind him. Gong turns around with another attack but is blocked by the scabbard again. Once again, his arm receives the energy backlash. The protagonist warns him again that he's going to break all his fingers before managing to do anything. Gong falls to the ground, saying this kid isn't faster than him, nor stronger than him. Looking at their energy and physicality, he's sure he could take on 10 of them at the same time. He stands up and tries another kick, but our boy dodges it. Gong doesn't understand why he can't land a single hit. No matter how slow he is, this guy dodges all his attacks with precision. He's sure this guy knows everything he's trying to do. He's a strange monster that he still can't even estimate how dangerous he is. Then our boy stands up again and says he's not going to keep things like this. He wanted to play a little, but now he's running out of energy. Sweating, Gong asks why someone like him didn't help Manhwa. The two remain silent. Chong Myong throws the sword onto his back and asks why he would answer that. To him, deluded people like Gong lived in fantasy worlds, so he wasn't interested. However, on the other hand, he wants to know why Gong has such refined martial arts for a shop owner. Even stranger is someone as skilled as him living in Manhwa's prefecture. Gong asks why a martial artist couldn't be a shop owner. Our boy says it's no problem. However, he's sure that with skills like that, Gong would be making more money elsewhere. Gong pretends not to know anything and says that doesn't make sense. But Chang Mayan tells him not to start with that nonsense. He's not going to believe that it wasn't an order from anyone and that Gong is there on his own. But Gong says that's exactly it. Our boy says they always say that in the end. However, it's time for the final question. He asks if Gong knows what he does to a person when he wants to get information from them. Confused, Gong asks how he would know that. Our boy clenches his fists and says he beats them until they start talking. At that moment, the poor fat man already knows he's going to get beaten. The protagonist then says there's no point in trying to get information from someone who's not willing to talk. That's why they need to follow a slightly more functional path. He runs toward him saying he's going to get the information or at least be satisfied with having beaten him up without getting it. At that moment, Gong notices that he's coming for his left knee. The problem is that at that speed, he can't block the attack. But suddenly, he gets hit in the shoulder. He's confused because all the movements indicated an attack on his knee. He sees another blow coming and realizes there's a strike that's going to hit the center of his head. He raises his arm to try to defend himself, but in reality, it was the hilt coming from below. The poor guy takes a blow to the neck. He stumbles backward, wondering how the blow hit below when he saw the strike coming from above. To him, the protagonist is all blurry. He keeps getting hit, seeing the attacks and not being able to dodge them. He's starting to realize that at this rate, he's going to die. He can see by the calm look in his eyes that this guy has already killed countless people. Our boy then starts drawing his sword. Gong, stumbling backward, says to himself that he doesn't want to die. Once again, Chang Mayan comes to cut him down the middle. Gong, scared, raises his hand to defend himself. Suddenly, a blue energy spreads through the forest. When the smoke clears, he's standing there exhausted. Someone asks how he knows the Tai God's palm technique. It was the protagonist who had crouched down. He asks if, by chance, Gong was from the Southern Edge sect. He then says that now he understands this whole coincidence. Gong had put Manhwa in debt and even has techniques that belong to the Southern Edge. So he asks if Gong was sent by them to this place. At that moment, Gong realizes he made a mistake. It would have been better to die than reveal that he knows this technique, especially to someone from Manhwa. He had made a critical error. The problem was that when the cut came down on him, he was certain he was going to die since the sword had been drawn from its sheath. While he's muttering, Chang Mayan just asks if he's not going to answer. He comments that, in a way, it's honorable, as it shows a certain loyalty. Our boy knows he can't underestimate the Southern Edge, especially since Manhwa, and they had always been rivals a long time ago. But today, while the Southern Edge still has a firm place among the top 10 strongest sects, Manhwa is a mess. Yet it's strange for a sect like that to handle things in such a low manner. This means that either Gong doesn't know the full story or what he knows is all a lie. He laughs and says that in the past, the world was also desolate, but there was still a bit of honor. As if it wasn't enough that one sect wants to steal Manhwa's techniques, now the other one wants to take the entire prefecture. Gong remains silent. Then he asks if this wouldn't be better for Manhwa. He's sure the boy also knows there's no future for that place anymore. Now that they've lost the techniques and power they once had, it's impossible for them to become the powerhouse of the past. There was only a matter of time before they collapse, and Gong was just doing a favor by making it happen sooner. That's because a martial sect without the techniques of previous generations is destined to die. Our boy asks, who said that? And Gong replies that everyone should already know that. However, he corrects him, asking who said they no longer have the techniques of past generations. He begins to threaten to cut him in half, saying that first he needs to confirm the information before spreading it around. Chang Mayan remembers that Manhwa and the Southern Edge sect had many similarities, which is why they were connected. Both used swords as the main weapon for their martial techniques. They were located close to each other, and everyone talked about the rivalry between the two in this region. That's why they always fought, and he would end up beating up the Southern Edge people. Gong then says that he's not from the Southern Edge, and our boy replies that he's not from Manhwa either. They exchange insults, and Chang Mayan tells him to be quiet. He then places the sword under Gong's chin and says he's going to show him something interesting, since Gong showed him the Tei Palm technique. He slowly lifts him up, saying that if he knows what's about to happen, it will be an interesting experience. But it will be very sad if he can't even understand it. Either way, he should explain it to the person who sent him here. Suddenly, his sword becomes a blur. Gong is shocked as a series of cuts come at him. The attacks seem to almost hit him, but barely miss. Gong has to protect himself, but the wind created by the cuts is enough to pull his body backward. However, nothing is touching him, so what is Chang Mayan trying to do? Chang Mayan then says that cherry blossoms have the strongest scent when they bloom in winter. That season hadn't arrived yet, but Manhwa's spirit hadn't disappeared either. He then swings his sword, saying that spring was still on its way. Gong lowers his arms and looks up. He sees a flurry of petals falling between him and Chang Mayan, who says that the cherry blossoms are about to fall over the entire mountain once again. Gong is confused, looking up, not understanding what he's seeing. It seemed like hundreds of petals were coming toward his forehead. He continues to watch as they slowly approach. of the 24 techniques of Manhwa, the cherry blossom storm. At that moment, the poor man falls to his knees and our boy sheaths his sword. Gong's body hits the ground and our boy even spits a bit of blood, saying that at this rate he's wearing himself out more than his enemies. What used to be child's play is now leaving him exhausted. He suddenly looks to the side and calls out to one of the merchants. The man, trembling all over, comes to speak with him, and our boy tells him to come closer quickly. He then talks to the four of them and asks who likes to get beaten up before leaving. Everyone stays silent, as no one is in the mood for that. He then asks who would prefer to leave without getting punched in the face. Everyone raises their hands, saying that would be pretty nice. Xiang Maiyang was about to talk about cooperation, but the guys just run off thanking him. At that moment, he yells for everyone to stay still. They look back, hesitating, and our boy asks if they really don't know how to use their heads. How was he supposed to take these carts if everyone left? He then shouts, demanding to know the value of what was in the carts, and the guys begin saying that there were between 1,800 and 2,300 coins. Another cart had 8,000. And our boy is even confused by all that wealth. He then tells them to go to the city of Zhenjiang and bring that money back, because he's going to sell their own carts to them. It's best to bring the money without saying who it's for, or else he'll kill them right there. The guy is confused about this business of selling their carts to themselves, and asks what happens if the person sent to Zhenjiang doesn't come back with the money. Our boy laughs, asking what they plan to do after they run away. After all, they won't be able to re-establish their businesses without what's in those carts. What's in there is their future in this world, so they better come back with the money if they want to take those things back. One of them raises his hand and asks what happens if they tell the government about our boy. Our boy just kicks the ground and warns that they can try, but they better never come back here and flee to the other side of the continent. The poor merchants realize there's no way to escape from this lunatic. He then tells them to stop standing around and hurry up to gather the money. Sometime later, he's sniffing the bills, saying this is incredible. He comes back all excited and jumps into the sect. Meanwhile, Jojiel is wringing out his sweat-soaked shirt. The people are exhausted, wondering if they'll really have to do this every morning. But he feels that a lot has changed. Now they actually seem like a group of martial arts practitioners. At that moment, Yanzhang asks why he's smiling like that. He replies the same thing, saying that now they look like a group of martial artists. He thought it was a strange idea to have, considering they always had been. But his friend says he understands him. After all, he's been thinking the same thing. A few days ago, he couldn't imagine himself training so hard at Mount Hoa. But now it's time to return to the second training session of the day. All they tried to do before was pass the time, climb the mountain, and do some half-hearted training. But ever since he arrived, many things had changed. He knew it was all thanks to Xiang Maiyang. Surely he was bringing numerous changes to Mount Hoa. For now, it was just a small breeze in this entire place. But no one knew the impact it would have in the future. When he arrives at the sect, he hears someone shouting not to put that there, and telling the workers to hurry up and keep bringing more. As they look, there are a bunch of workers entering the sect. Many are carrying stones, saying to bring everything without breaking anything and ordering them to work faster. The third-year students entered, trying to understand what was happening. Anam was ordering everyone around until Yunzhang called out to him. He approached and asked what was going on. The master explained that those men were all workers. They were there to repair the entire temple. As he probably guessed, the place was in terrible shape and in desperate need of repairs. At that moment, the chief asks what they thought they were doing, and the boys are confused. He tells them there's a lot of material to bring in for them to work on, so they better get going. They're startled and say they're going, but they just finished training. That night, they wonder what that was. Looking at a chicken, they wonder if they're dreaming. Everyone is shocked, wondering if that was real food. They start drooling and get excited to eat. The changes that Xiang Maiyang had brought to the sect were starting to appear faster than they expected. That same night, Jojiel and Yanzhang were walking outside, saying they never expected all this to happen. So much construction, new food, and even new uniforms. At that moment, Yanzhang stops and Jojiel asks what he's thinking about. He responds that he's just thinking about how incredible money is. He knew they had received a lot, but didn't expect the sect to spend it all like that. Yanzhang says the suffering they went through was because, unfortunately, they had no choice. Besides, he had never heard Unam laugh like that before. Jojiel then asks what they should do from now on. Yanzhang says that just as Mount Hoa is going through many changes, they will also need to change. It's not just about financial prosperity. He remembers seeing several martial arts books inside that chest. At the moment they were leaving for training, Xiang Maiyang said that an incredible coincidence had happened. He had found a chest full of bars and techniques. Jojiel says his pretending was terrible. What he doesn't understand is how he managed to get all that. Yanzhang says he has no idea. But the only thing for sure is that many changes are going to happen in this place. Inevitably, they are also caught up in the storm that's about to start, and they'll need to be ready. Otherwise, they'll be swept away by this wind of change. Jojiel tells him not to worry because he's confident. The only thing he wants to know is where Xiang Maiyang is, since he's been missing since morning. His friend replies that he heard he went to talk to the sect leader. The scene shifts to a conversation with the leader, who says our boy deserves a reward for finding that treasure, and that's the only reason he was called there. Our boy is a bit confused, and the chief wants to know if there's anything he wants. He says that maybe Chang Mayong still wants part of the treasure he delivers, so if he wants, he can keep some of it. But Chang Mayong says he's not that interested in wealth, and the elder is left confused. But our boy just says that there isn't much to buy at Manhwa anyway. The old man smiles, saying that he knows the path to enlightenment and has abandoned his attachment to wealth. However, the truth is that he doesn't want money because he already has plenty after robbing the merchant. The elder then asks if he wants any martial or advanced techniques, and he replies that he doesn't want that either. Confused, the sect leader wants to know why he isn't interested in something like that. Our boy simply says there must be a reason why the ancestors established a rule that each technique must be learned. The elder feels a bit awkward, thinking that makes sense. However, our boy only said that because he's the one who has to teach these fools. There were many techniques he still had to pass on, but he had to do it naturally, without raising suspicion. He's unsure of what he wants from Mount Hoa, as the only thing that matters to him now is the name. Then he gets an idea and says he wants permission to go to Huayan's prefecture whenever he wants. The rascal's main goal was to gain more freedom to mess around in the world. Hyeonjong asks why, and he says that being stuck in that place is stunting his growth as a martial artist. Perhaps if he could go out and explore the world, he would grow more. The leader says he understands, but that would be a violation of the sect's regulations. Considering what he's achieved, it would be deserved, but the problem is that many people might complain that it's unfair. He then asks if there's anything else our boy wants. But our boy doesn't know what else he wants besides freedom. Then he says he has an idea. He says that his body is in terrible condition, and the chief asks what he means by that. Our boy says that his internal energy seems to have been damaged. The leader again says he understands, but asks why he's mentioning that. Our brave boy then says he wants some life-replenishing pills. The chief is a bit confused, so he clarifies that he wants the pills that restore a person's life energy. Everyone stares at the chief, and our boy is hopeful. Hyeonjong then drinks his water, bangs the table, and says that from now on, he is authorized to leave Mount Hoa. The instructors all agree, and our boy is confused. They start pushing him out, and our boy asks why, considering that before, they said it wasn't possible. However, the old man throws him out, saying he's not responsible for whatever he does in the prefecture. But our boy is fuming because he wanted the life-replenishing pills. Unfortunately, the old man doesn't have any for him. Hyeonjong then closes the door and asks what they think of the boy. Manem simply says that he is clearly a true prodigy, and the elder agrees. Even though he's just a child, he can sense wisdom in him. Clearly, he's not completely right in the head, but that's understandable at his age. Manem reflects that when he talks to the boy, it doesn't feel like he's speaking to a child. Moreover, he doesn't seem to have the immaturity one would expect. He has the aura of a veteran martial artist, and someone like that can only be described as a prodigy. The elder then asks Hyeon-sang what he thinks of the boy. Hyeon-sang, however, explains that everyone knows he's not the best person to judge others. The leader says he understands but still wants his opinion. He stays silent, thinking for a second, and says that the boy is a child who doesn't act like a child. That's the impression he has of him. Anem realizes he's not the only one who sees the boy that way. Hyeon-sang then says he's met mature children who had difficult early lives. However, they were mature compared to children, whereas Chang Mayon genuinely seems like an adult. The master asks if he thinks there's something wrong with the boy, and he says he doesn't think so. The leader ponders this and says he appreciates their thoughts, but that they don't need to look too deeply into it. The boy is still just a child, so that's how they'll see him. Their goal here is to help everyone reach their potential and correct any flaws. The two acknowledge the leader, saying they understand. He then asks Unam how the repairs are going. Unam explains that since it's hard to bring things up the mountain, they're having to collect the trees from there. The problem is that it will take time to cut everything and then dry the wood. Jong asks if he has any objections to using all the money on these superficial things, and Unam immediately says no. The leader then says he hopes everyone understands that Mount Hoa must be reborn. They will rebuild the sect's appearance as well as its martial arts. Wanam agrees, saying that's a very wise decision. He then asks Sang to understand the new martial arts books as quickly as possible so that they can be used. He also requests that he be extremely careful, as there can be no mistakes in what the boys will learn. Song just assures him that he personally guarantees it won't happen. Jong thanks him, saying he trusts both of them. However, Song is a bit hesitant. He's not sure if he should tell the leader that those books are too new for something that's supposed to be hundreds of years old. Not to mention that some of them had a bit of ink recently spilled on them, so it seems like someone rewrote them. But maybe he's just being paranoid because the content clearly had no malicious intent. To him, it means that someone is trying to benefit Mount Hoa while remaining anonymous at the same time. Meanwhile, our boy is outside, furious for being kicked out just because he asked for the pills, especially after all the hard work he had to do rewriting those crazy techniques. And the look on the leader's face made it clear they don't even know how to produce the life pearls anymore. The problem is that things are getting complicated for him now. Every fight, he has to deal with those side effects caused by opening the door. And worse, is becoming more severe than he expected. His body is taking too long to recover, and at this rate, it will take at least a year. He knows that staying still for half a year is the end of everything for someone his age. A child's body is constantly growing and changing. That's why this is the perfect time to build the foundation of martial arts and strengthen the body. The boy is stuck and needs to find a solution. There are only two ways to recover innate Ki. Either you consume a panacea, which is the life pearl, or you recover it through someone else via Ki transfer technique. The problem is, no one is going to want to transmit energy to him for now. What's strange is that in the past, there were so many of these pearls around that he used to find them lying on the ground. There were so many in the sect that he sometimes used them as hangover cures. The rascal starts gesturing, pretending to pour a drink, saying that speaking of which, he misses something like that. Then he pauses for a second. He thinks about the hangover and suddenly seems to remember something. He knew exactly where he could get a remedy like that. Immediately, he runs through the forest, saying he's sure it's still there. Being an idiot sometimes has its uses. A while later, he's looking up at a giant mountain. It was the highest and most dangerous peak in all of Manhwa. And the worst part is that the place he's looking for is right in the heart of it all. A cave that, even among all the disciples, he was the only one who knew about. Back in the day, he hid there when he was running away from the leader, and it really helped a lot. It was the perfect place to drink without anyone finding him, which makes him wonder why they let him stay in the sect instead of kicking him out when he was younger. But that's not important right now. He needed to climb it and find that panacea. In his past life, he could have reached it with 2 jumps, but that's impossible with his body. So he leaves and comes back with a rope. He heads up the mountain convinced that descending is better than climbing. Of course, there's the small danger that he could just fall and die. But he's determined, saying you only live once. Or technically, he's living twice. The rope is tied to a tree and the climbing mission begins. The simple reason training is forbidden here is the deadly fall. There's barely anywhere to put your feet or hold on. The poor guy slips at this moment and starts free falling. He's scared, saying he's going to die. But when the rope reaches its limit, his body is pulled upward. At least he's glad he tied a decent knot. However, now he's swinging toward the mountain. He concentrates energy in his hand and slams it into the mountain as he swings back. But the bone in his arm breaks. Still, he manages to activate the adhesion seal, which makes him stick to the rock. The obvious problem now is that one of his arms is broken, but at least he could see the entrance to the hideout. He could reach it if he released the adhesion seal and used a bit of momentum. He steps, starts swinging back and forth, and after a few swings, he's ready to leap. But the rope snaps right then. Once again, he has to activate the adhesion seal, but the bones in his hands start to break. He keeps slipping, hitting the wall, and almost falling out. Barely he hangs on and manages to pull himself up into the cave. He's already cursing, saying it's a lie that he was the master of the fluorescent blade. As he enters the cave, he sees everything covered. He approaches and pulls it away. The boy had even left a lamp here, which apparently never goes out, He opens the chest, and inside it, there's another chest that he hopes contains what he's looking for, the life-replenishing pills. As soon as he begins to open it, energy flows through his body. It felt like countless cherry trees had blossomed in the cave. There were even some white pills, which were much rarer and more powerful. Our boy apologizes to the past Jangman, saying that at least he didn't steal the most expensive one. The first priority was to recover his vitality, and it would be even better if, in the process, he could increase his internal energy. Without hesitation, he pops the first one into his mouth, and it dissolves into his body. The energy spreads, and he starts to exhale, trying to stay focused. Little by little, everything that was trying to spread through his body begins to condense into a single grain. The problem is that it still needs to be further purified before it can be integrated into his energy core. After all, he wants to create the perfect body using only pure energy. That's why he's rejecting any impure energy. The small remaining fragments merge into the core. The pill shatters, his energy core begins to glow, and the entire cave turns blue. The pearls began to fall to the ground, and the boy was already soaring in his cultivation. His eyes turned blue, and the boy was transcending, already screaming. His hands were trembling, but after a while, he finally opened his eyes. His injuries and even his broken bones were regenerating, and his body was already feeling stronger than before. Using the full power of a pearl like this in such a young body had a much greater effect than he had imagined. Even the toxins were beginning to be expelled from his body. The only thing strange was that his heart was beating too fast. The excess energy was like waves destroying his body from the inside. And if it reached the energy core in his head, he could end up losing everything. He needed to stop this flow, but the energy wasn't diminishing. In a conversation with Jangman, he had asked if he was a devotee or a martial artist. Jangman explained that a martial artist seeks control and suppression, while devotees tend to let things happen at their natural pace. He had asked our boy how he would suppress the laws of the universe. If you tried to block a river, eventually the water would find another path. And that's why Jangman preferred to let things be, as they were meant to be. Humans are part of nature, just like any other animal. So why wouldn't they already have their fate in this universe? With his hand on his chest, he thought about this idea of letting things flow. He found himself in his sea of consciousness, looking up and seeing a great wall beginning to crack. He recognized it as the top of his body's energy. That was the entrance gate, and seeing all those cracks showed how destroyed his body was. When he placed his hand on it, he could feel a strong vibration on the other side. Judging by the pace of things, it was only a matter of time before the wall fell. Eventually, it would collapse, and if it all opened at once, he would be taken with it. Just as Jamin had said, you can't block a river because it finds a new path. If he tried to stop this wave, he would be defeated, so he would have to let it flow somehow. He then opened a small hole in the wall. The water started flowing under his feet, and he realized Jamin had always been right. It took him 100 years to understand that nature has its place for every person, but he had finally learned that. The energy then flowed to the center of his head. Sometime later, the day dawned. He woke up in the cave, and the boy who had been floating fell to the ground like an idiot. He was confused, wondering how he had been flying. But when he looked at his palm, he remembered what had happened. All the energy pathways in his body had been opened, and this child's body had somehow survived. All thanks to the teachings of Brother Jamin. The risk had been high, but so was the reward. Not only had he restored his innate energy, but he had also increased his reserves. In other words, his potential had only grown. As he left the cave, he thought that the words he once found tedious now held immeasurable value. In his past life, he had simply been a swordsman and not a devotee. But Manhwa is both a martial arts academy and an ascetic sect. That's the true nature of this place, but he had only ever understood half of it. This made him scratch his head, wondering if he could really restore something like that. But regardless of what he could achieve, he just had to give it his best. He no longer had any use for the pills in the box, but the others in the sect would benefit greatly from them. It was time to finally return, but not before grabbing the liquor he had left behind, of course. Manhwa had changed a lot, but that place was still intact, and spending time there made him feel like the old days. It was as if he finally belonged to it all again. Sooner or later, he would return to that cave, but for now, it was time to return to Manhwa. He leaped across the mountains. He even paused stylishly to admire the sunset. Finally, his body felt extremely light. He decided to take in the scent of the mountains, but it reeked horribly. The purification had turned him into a walking chemical weapon. Meanwhile, back at the sect, everyone was frozen and shivering from the cold. It was early, and they were heading out for training, wondering how long they'd have to keep this up. One of them commented that Chang Mayong had been acting strange lately. He looked worn out, like he was sick and exhausted. One of them then said that maybe the rumors were true, that he had suffered an energy surge. This caught everyone's attention as they agreed he looked very tired. Maybe he was avoiding training because he couldn't handle it anymore. The group concluded that this meant they no longer needed to train so hard either. One of them gathered the courage to ask why they had been following his orders until now. It was just because he could beat them all single-handedly before. But now that he was exhausted, things had changed. If they all teamed up, they could finally beat the boy. Jojiel, standing to the side, was just observing the murmurs, and Yunjong told them to let them do what they wanted. Soon enough, they'd face reality. The gate began to open. Someone approached, glowing, and the group was already terrified. It's our boy, exuding an aura. They don't understand how this guy, who was nearly dead, showed up with skin glowing brighter than ever. At that moment, Chang Mayong says he understands why everyone is mad at him. Lately, he's been neglecting training due to his health. For that reason, he sincerely apologizes. Immediately, the guys know revenge is coming and tell him not to worry, that everything is fine, and he doesn't need to come back. But our boy tells them to stop lying. He knows they've been training hard even when he wasn't around. This dissatisfaction is his fault for being a terrible instructor. That's why he'll do his best to make up for those lost days. And for that, obviously, there's nothing better than even more intense training. He points behind him toward the mountain and tells everyone to run. They're all confused, wondering what he means by that. Kiang Mayong just says it's a race and whoever comes in last will have to run twice. One of them was about to complain about climbing to the Lotus Flower Peak, but Yun Zhong had already started running. Jojiel followed, telling him to wait up. The poor others just stood there watching them go. At that moment, another one said that at this rate he'd be the last and started walking. And suddenly, everyone panicked and ran off. Our boy says they're bold to be thinking about starting a mutiny. However, having the mentality to change things is good. After all, those who only follow orders will eventually hit a limit. But there's nothing worse than complaining without effort. A martial artist earns the right to speak through training and skill development, and that's exactly what he's there to ensure. Throughout the millennia that martial arts have existed in the world, countless people have become the strongest. But a single individual was never strong enough to carry a sect alone, which shows that for a sect to be strong, all the disciples must be strong too. His goal is to make sure that Mount Hu surpasses the glory of the old Mount Hua. He then yells that the last one today won't get dinner. The sun is finally starting to rise between the mountains, and the poor disciples are already lying on the ground, defeated as usual. Jojiel, exhausted, looks back and sees Yunjong getting up. He's impressed that this guy is trying so hard. It was clear why he's truly the senior brother. This wasn't a matter of strength or skill anymore. It was simply the foundation of willpower. A stone falls to the ground and someone asks why the sun has already risen. It's Chang Mayong with a bunch of weights saying that whoever has finished their training should give him the weights because he wants to use them. At that moment, he looks around and wonders why everyone is sleeping. While he complains that training had barely begun, Jojiel is staring at him, thinking he's a monster. He says these kids nowadays really can't be taken seriously, but everyone knows he's the youngest one there. He then drops the weights and says that's it for today. But he warns that whoever skips training tomorrow will train 10 times harder afterward. Before leaving, he tells them to clean everything up and put the equipment away. The others are just thinking he's a bastard. Sometime later at breakfast, Yeonjong asks the guy next to him if he's lost his appetite, to which he replies that he's afraid of vomiting if he eats anything. They'd all turn to Yeonjong, calling him Big Brother, and ask if this training regime hasn't gone too far. Everyone agrees, saying they're starting to fear dying because of it, barely able to stop trembling. They didn't want Yeonjong to say anything to Chang Mayan and were pleading with him. They turned to Jeol and asked what he thought about it. He stayed silent for a moment. He said he agreed that the training was getting harder each day and was pushing his body to its limit. Iron gets stronger when struck, but that's not the case with humans. However, he's sure that the bastard Chang Mayan knows this too. For now, he thinks they just need to endure it, and if nothing changes, then they can talk to him. The group smiles, saying maybe that makes sense. Yeonjong says fine, if something like that happens, he'll talk to him. Sometime later, Jeol collapses into bed. It's time to sleep and then wake up to train all day again. He thought he could handle this training no matter how tough he was. But he's already passing out, wondering if he'll be able to keep up at this rate, until someone calls for senior brother. He wakes up and sees it's Chang Mayan. He says it was really hard to find this, but he's giving it to him. Confused, Jeol asks what it is. Then we see the red light, and he already knows. It was a plum blossom pill. Our boy tells him to keep quiet, but he's shouting, asking where he found it. But Chang Mayan just says he believes it will be very useful to him, and he tells him not to tell anyone else about it. Jeol is overwhelmed with emotion. Then Chang Mayan tells him to consume it quickly, and he'll help guide his ki. Jeol is moved, saying he'll never think of the boy as a heartless monster again. When it came time to help, Chang Mayan was always the one who showed up. However, our boy is grinning wickedly, thinking the real hell is about to begin. The next morning, everyone was training and shining brightly. Obviously, our boy must have done the same for everyone else. And Eunjun quickly noticed that something was different. The attacks of each of the boys were much more precise. However, they were practicing the same techniques. The dexterity of movement and the speed also seemed to have improved. Each sequence of attacks was emanating strength. Their upper bodies were stable with more muscle behind the sword. He didn't understand how all these people had improved so much in such a short time. That's when he remembered our boy asking for a month of training. He guaranteed they would see a difference. Eunjun began to wonder how it was possible that just one morning of training had caused all this. But the look in everyone's eyes was full of passion for training. He stayed silent and then said that everyone was full of energy today. He was extremely excited to see them all working so hard in training. And he said that if they kept it up, he would allow them to advance to the final stages. He would teach everyone the great sword pacification technique. The boys got excited, saying that learning something like that would be incredible. It really showed that they were improving. Eunjun smiled, saying that when the boys worked hard, he needed to reward them, so they would learn to strive even harder. But that's when Jong appeared, calling for Eunjun. A little later, beyond the wall, Jong asked what brought him there. Jong said it seemed like they had a problem. It was the book of the 6 elements sword technique that Chang Mayan had found. He told Eunjun to take a look at the last page, and Eunjun was shocked. He was confused, wondering what it was. The message was directed to the successors, saying that there was no shame in developing and altering Manhua's arts. After all, martial artists continue to progress and increase their chances of survival. However, the 6 elements were the foundation of everything, and changing this technique was the same as changing the entire spirit of the sect. This was something the successors should always keep in mind. Eunjun knew that the 6 elements was the technique that had kept Manhua alive for all these generations. Just as a novice learns to hold a sword, all martial artists learn the 6 elements technique. He then asked Jong if they were really going to teach something like that again. It was a technique that took a long time for a disciple to learn, which is why a new one was developed. Jong said he agreed with that, and that's exactly why he was there, as he knew it was Manhua's wish to reorganize the 6 elements technique and make the true technique easier to learn. However, they also needed to pay attention to the words of those who came before them. The trainer thought that something like this was actually much more important to consider. That's because the words of those who came before indicate the path those in the future should take. This is the foundation of learning, so they couldn't ignore such a clear warning. That's why the leader came to get the trainer's opinion. He thought about the options of following tradition or pursuing change. After a while, he said that the reason they created this 6 elements technique was because they had little time on their hands. They didn't know when Manhua would come to an end, so they decided to speed up the process for beginners. After all, it was pointless to try to build a foundation when there was no future. The question he wanted to know then was whether the leader now saw a future for Manhua. Jong stayed silent for a second, pondering that future. The situation had improved a lot, but they still had a myriad of problems. He then said that it wasn't a very difficult question, and that's why he hoped Eunjun understood that he didn't have a clear answer. Jong said that if that's the case, he was against restoring the 6 elements. The leader then asked why. Jong looked back and said the reason would be a tough one. The technique they created might have originated from the original, but it was completely different. The 6 elements is a slow but steady art that tries to gradually overwhelm the opponent, whereas the new technique is extremely fast, agile, and fluid. The kids learned quickly and had already accepted all the principles of the new technique. And trying to change the original path now could mean that in the future, they wouldn't master either of the two. Besides, the original technique required extremely stable legs and a lot of focus, and he thought it was too late for that. The leader asked him to repeat that, and he said the kids needed stable legs. That's when he noticed something and looked back. Seeing the boys' stances, he realized they had the legs necessary to master that technique. Zhang said it seemed like Unjum had been training them very well. However, he was confused because he had never trained them in anything like that. Then he looked to the side and saw Chang Mayong scratching his nose, and he began to wonder if this was that kid's doing. He then asked the leader for permission, saying he wanted to get one of the boys' opinions. He called for our boy, who was startled. Unjum told him to come over as he had something to ask, and Chang Mayong agreed. Unjum asked him which option was better, reaching the highest possible point slowly or reaching the destination quickly, which was the right path for Manhwa to take. The protagonist pointed upward and said the right answer was always to aim for the highest point. Unjum asked why, and our boy said it's because this is the Manhwa sect. Zhang seemed impressed. The boy carried all the pride of this sect's history, and to think that the ideal that existed in this place long ago came from the mouth of the youngest one. Chang Mayong said that if it were any other sect, the second option would be correct, but in the case of Manhwa, it's a different reality. The only way to restore the honor and glory of the past was to not compromise the future in any way. Zhang was impressed that the boys seemed to understand the meaning behind Ong's words. The leader asked if this was just because they were Manhwa, and our boy said that's what he thought at least. They exchanged glances and told him it was fine and he could return to his position. As our boy left, they talked among themselves, saying it was embarrassing. They never expected to hear words like that from a child. The only reason he gave was that they were in Manhwa sect. Unjum said that something like that was only possible for him to say because he was still a child. His goals and ideals hadn't yet been tainted by reality, and although it was difficult, he didn't want to embarrass himself in front of that child. That simple conversation, however, would lead them to make a difficult decision. Choosing the fundamental technique of a sect was extremely important because it defined the future of the entire sect. He then told Unjum to pay attention as he was about to make a decree as the leader of Manhwa. From now on, this would change. They would abandon the alterations they had made and return to using the 6 elements technique. Not only that, but they would also incorporate all the techniques left by their ancestors. And as the teacher of the third-year students, he had a crucial role in all of this. They couldn't continue to accept being a powerless sect forever. As long as this place was Manhwa, they should be striving to become the strongest. That was the duty and goal of everyone who belonged to this sect. Furthermore, those children were the future. Perhaps because of this choice, he wouldn't see any significant changes in this generation. However, when these boys became the leaders of this place, the sect would return to its former prominence. While they pondered all of this, Chang Mayong was muttering that they were pathetic. Why did these idiots dare to ask him something like that? He had put the food in their mouths, and they were still asking how to chew it. It seemed like there was no hope of them ever getting anything right. Whatever they were doing, they were probably doing it wrong. It was time for him to visit Hua's prefecture, because they were surely making a mess of that place too. He shouted for everyone to hear that the sect was a mess without him. After years of hardship, the sect was finally at peace. The biggest problem, which was financial, had been resolved, and the old techniques had been reestablished to ensure the sect's future. Everyone was happy and the place was filled with laughter. But for our boy, peace was far from reality. The city was a complete mess. Sitting on a crate, he asked Zhou Jiul if he was really the son of a merchant family. Zhou Jiul said yes, and our boy asked him what it was like to run a big business on this continent. Zhou Jiul said it wasn't a big business, just a small shop. Our boy said that as an only son, Zhou Jiul must know some secret or something going on there. Zhou Jiul looked confused, wondering what he was talking about. Our boy told him to forget it. They both looked back, and our boy asked why the place was in such chaos. His friend said it was because of the previous owners of that place. Even though they were bandits, they treated the employees well, and when they left, everyone disappeared. Or rather, you could say they'd brought a bunch of family members, and once one left, everyone went with them. Chang Mayong then asked if it was due to a lack of workers, and Zhou Jiul said that was one of the reasons. He hesitated and said the other problem was that the people at the top of Mount Hua didn't have the skills to manage these businesses. It was like putting a pearl necklace on a pig. The guys from Mount Hua were all arguing with each other because they were bringing the wrong items. Zhou Jiul said that running a business like this wasn't an easy task. You had to know about each item and material. If the material was too good, they wouldn't profit enough. But if it was too poor, they wouldn't attract any customers. And if you hired people to take care of it, you'd end up with no money left. Our boy said they could start learning how to manage the business. Zhou Jiul asked if he would teach a 40-year-old man some martial arts, and he said no. He then said that wasn't the only problem. They also had difficulties when they wanted to buy certain items. They didn't have the connections, so if they sent someone to buy something, the poor guy would end up like a beggar and lose all the money they had. Zhou Jiul said that this whole business thing was very difficult and wasn't working. Trying to manage this whole place had been a mistake from the start. Our boy looked up and thought of Jiangman. He was starting to realize just how important that guy was. Back then, he didn't worry about any of this and everything worked out fine. But he'd rather die than go through all of this suffering. He asked Zhou Jiul what the solution was, and he said he had no idea. If he had that skill, he would have become a successful merchant by now. But not even his father could solve that problem. It was a shame, but there was nothing they could do. To run a business like that, you either needed to have most of the items or a background full of connections. It would be nice if Elder Huang were in better financial shape. Confused, Zhang Maiyang asked who that was. Zhou explained that Huang was a great merchant, a kind of magnate who traded with the entire state of Shaanxi. In the past, he was one of Manhua's sponsors, and it was his support that prevented the total collapse of the sect. The protagonist asked why he sponsored them, considering there weren't any decent martial artists there. He saw Zhou making a face and asked what was wrong. Zhou said it was nothing and just mentioned that Huang sponsored several sects, and that if he were around, he would surely give them plenty of advice on how to manage everything. Our boy said the problem was solved then, since they just had to go and ask him for help. But unfortunately, it wasn't going to be that easy. Huang had been bedridden for over a year due to a coma. At that moment, Zhang Maiyang sat down, realizing it really wasn't going to be easy. Suddenly, someone was calling for our boy. It was Yunem, and he asked what was going on. He approached the two and said there was a task. He would have to return to the mountain, and our boy asked why. Climbing that mountain was incredibly difficult, and he was sure there were stronger and better prepared brothers. He was the youngest here with weak thigh and shorter legs. Anam, however, told him to stop stalling because he was also the one with the least to do. Our boy said he had just been sweeping the whole courtyard, for goodness sake. But seeing the broken broom, he quickly asked what the task was. Anam explained that he had to deliver a letter to the finance office, and it was extremely important. It was from the Yunha Exchange Company, so he had better not lose it. Zhou warned our boy that the Yunha Exchange Company belonged to Master Huang. He then grabbed the letter and said it would be delivered as quickly as possible. A little while later, in the mountains, he looked to the side and pulled out the letter. A letter from the famous Master Huang of negotiations, or probably from one of his employees, since Huang wasn't conscious to speak, for that matter. He saw the seal and gave a small smile. He knew what he was about to do was wrong, but he apologized to Jiangmen in advance. The message said it was only for the sect leader's eyes, but our boy was curious about what kind of message someone bedridden was trying to send. He was sure they'd appreciate a little help from him. He opened it and took a look. The letter started by getting straight to the point. It was shameless to send this letter after years of silence, but he had to do it for his father's sake. He knew everyone's time eventually came, but the signs his father was showing didn't seem related to age. His heartbeat was erratic and his skin had turned a strange red color. He had completely lost consciousness and could no longer move. In addition, a red spot had appeared between his eyebrows. Zhang Maiyang seemed to recall the Chiama. They had called every doctor from all over the country, but none of them could correctly diagnose his father. It was out of pure desperation that he was sending messages to everyone his father knew. He asked that if the sect leader recognized even a little bit of these symptoms, to please send a message. And for anyone who could alleviate his father's illness, they promised a large reward in the name of the Yunha Exchange Post. The letter was sent by the vice president. However, our protagonist was shocked, saying that of course normal doctors wouldn't be able to treat him. This illness was known as the demon flower. From the outside, it looked like the person was poisoned by some kind of venom, which was why most doctors tried to find an antidote. However, the reason he was alarmed by this news was because this illness was caused by certain techniques from the demonic cult clan. He clenched his teeth, remembering those fanatics. He had thought he wiped them all out that day on the 100-foot mountain. The problem was that not only had they survived, but it seemed like they were once again planning to bring destruction to the world. What he didn't understand was why those damn people had something against Manhwa. Every time they got in his way, the country was enormous. So why did they have to mess with one of the people who had helped them? But it was undeniable that this was a problem. He couldn't confirm anything without seeing it in person, so it looked like he would have to visit this guy. Besides, his eyes had already lit up since they mentioned a large reward. According to Zhou, the Yonghai Exchange Group was extremely wealthy. The advantage he had was that few people knew about this nowadays. The universe really worked in mysterious ways. Some of those demons seemed to have survived the war. He feared that some of these survivors might see this letter. Immediately, he took off running, saying he couldn't let something like this happen. No one in this world could steal the reward he deserved. And for the money, or rather for the good of the sect, he was going to go cure this man right now. Night fell, and the others were heading back to the sect, exhausted. That's when someone called out for Yunzhang. It was Zhou, looking all worried. However, the senior didn't understand, wondering why each day his friend seemed to be going crazier. But Zhou shouted that it was an emergency. It was something else Zhang Maiyang had gotten up to. There wasn't time to explain, so he told him to just follow. When they opened the room, it was completely empty. Immediately, Yunzhang wanted to know where that boy had gone this time. Zhou said that wasn't the important part. It was the letter on the bed. The letter said he'd be gone on business for several days. They had to cover for him the best they could. And also, if they missed any training, they would be beaten as soon as he returned. Yunzhang as always cursed him out, calling him a bastard. Zhou wanted to know what they were supposed to do now. Yunzhang just told him to tell everyone to stay quiet. Zhou said that if they were caught, they'd be in trouble. But Yunzhang responded that it didn't matter. They were already in trouble. If he said he'd be back in a few days, they had no choice but to wait. He knew that people didn't keep such a close eye on the third-year boys, so maybe they'd get away with it. Poor Zhou was worried about what would happen, if they were discovered. But Yunjong said he was more worried about what made Chang Mayong leave for several days. Whatever it was, it would surely cause a lot of problems. In the forest, our boy was sprinting from tree to tree, still running. He hadn't stopped for a second, running through the entire night. He had already run 117 kilometers and was finally feeling exhausted. In his past life, however, jumping over a mountain was easy. He looked ahead and said that in any case, it had been a long time since he'd been there. The city of Xi'an, a place where a lot had happened. In the past, he would drink there, always in high spirits, thinking it was the best. He was the number 2 in the sect and loved walking around there because no one bothered him. He was already a little drunk and ended up bumping into a guy beside him. The bottle slipped out of his hand, falling to the ground, and the man turned, asking if he had no manners. He told him to apologize since he had been the one to bump into him. But when the man saw that he was from Manhwa, he said he smelled something rotten. Obviously, Xiaoming wasn't at all pleased by that. The drink continued to spill from the bottle, and in silence, he told his men to get ready. The man was confused and started laughing. He said he already knew they were a bunch of thugs, but he hadn't expected that they would also have no manners. He had seen many masters like him roaming the city, but in the end, they always ended up getting beaten. Besides, it was ridiculous for him to come all the way from Mount Hua just to cause trouble in the city of Xi'an. So the man warned that if Chang Mayong wanted, he could teach him a lesson about what happens when you step into someone else's territory. At that moment, Chang Mayong sobered up immediately. He approached the bottle and gave it an upward heel kick. The man glanced, and it was over before he even knew it. A tap on the neck for each of the 3. They took the hit. Chang Mayong grabbed the drink, and the poor guys were wrecked. Mount Hua sect and the Southern Edge sect had always been arch rivals. You could ask why they were rivals, but you could also reverse the question and ask why they wouldn't be. It starts with the fact that it's difficult for 2 strong sects to exist so close to each other, especially considering that both use sword techniques, which made them even more competitive. Constantly, the question of who was the stronger sect would arise. Because of this, many Mount Hua disciples avoided going to the city of Xi'an. Of course, going there with that smug smile was always the exception. It was the perfect place to escape the Elder's eyes, have fun, and drink plenty. He was never the one to start the fights with the Southern Edge guys, and every time they got beaten up, it was because they provoked him first. Naturally, the pile of bodies started stacking up. Eventually, he had to admit that those guys had a certain tenacity. No matter how many times they got beaten, they always came back. Perhaps it was that tenacity that led the Southern Edge to their current position. The conclusion of all this is that he's guaranteed to have problems if he runs into them again around here. However, since he's him, he's sure he'll be fine. Besides, the people around here probably don't even know him, so there shouldn't be any trouble. The scene shifts to a doctor checking Juan's pulse. The doctor let go of his hand and said, unfortunately, there was nothing they could do. Jiangwei thanked him and asked if it was really his father's fate to die this way. The doctor beside him said that the Tang family prided themselves on their knowledge of poisons, but unfortunately, he had no idea what was affecting his father. The son asked what it could be, and the doctor said that despite the symptoms, it didn't seem to be a type of poison. In his opinion, there was something more behind these symptoms. Jiangwei grabbed the doctor's shoulder and asked if it might have been some type of food. He then noticed the doctor hesitate and removed his hand. He apologized, saying he acted out of frustration. The doctor said he understood and was saddened that he couldn't help. Alone in the room, Jiangwei wondered what options were left. His father's health was getting worse day by day. He couldn't do anything for him, even with all the money they had. His father had always been generous to those with little, but now he was about to meet his end because of an unknown illness. Someone then called for the vice president and asked to enter. There was an elder from the Southern Edge sect named Maxian Jai. He said he was sorry to say it, but it was time to face reality. The only way to save Wang was with a Taoist ritual. The son said he understood the concern but didn't want to use that method just yet. However, Muxeng says that it's not every day you can have the Taoist ritual performed by him. But John Wee says he'll wait for the responses to all the letters he sent before making a decision. Clearly, the guy from the south isn't happy about that. And he says that all the work he's doing is utterly pointless. Zhang Wei is losing his patience with these provocations, but he has to endure all these impertinences. That's because Moksung is one of the elders of the Southern Edge sect. They've long been part of the 10 major sects, and lately, their name has been spreading across the country. Some even say that within a few generations, they could be the greatest sword sect. And that's why, as the vice president of a trading company, it's difficult for him to oppose someone like that. He's sure that this guy will demand a fortune for this so-called ritual. It's not even about the money he cares about. If it were to save his father's life, he'd give up everything he owns. However, he's certain that if the Southern sect really had the solution to the problem, they would first cure him and then ask for the money directly from his father, which shows that they have some other motive behind all this. But Mokshung says there's no other way. If even the best doctors haven't found the solution, it's impossible for him to be cured. Just then, someone calls for the vice president. He appears and asks what's going on. The man informs him that a messenger has arrived from Mount Hua. Zhang Wei is confused because the letter to Mount Hua was the last one sent. So why were they the first to arrive? Mokshung, however, asks what someone from that failing sect is doing there. He warns Jongwei that there must be a trick up their sleeve, so he better be careful. He puts a hand on the man and says that going to talk to this person is a waste of time. How could the most insignificant sect of today cure his father's illness? However, Jongwei says they came from afar to offer assistance, so it would be impolite not to receive them. Mok-sung just watches and says, "All right then." In the corridors, the servant informs that the person is still at the gate. Jongwei says that leaving the person at the gate was discourteous. The servant tries to explain that the situation is unusual, but he cuts him off, saying that's enough, they'll go meet this person right away. He arrives at the gate, opens it, and immediately apologizes for keeping him waiting outside. He introduces himself as Jongwei, the vice president of the place. The person says it's fine since he's not there for courtesies. Jongwei notices that the person had a very casual demeanor, and when he stands up, Jongwei is startled. It was our boy, calmly cleaning his ears. He's a bit confused, and the young man blows on his pinky finger. Jongwei then wants to know when the rest of the delegation would arrive. But Chang Mayong simply says he came alone, and Jongwei is already breaking into a cold sweat. The boy just says he's there alone and has a way to cure the old man, so they better take him inside quickly. Besides that, he wants to hear a bit about that huge reward they mentioned in the letter. Jongwei is completely baffled by this opportunist. The place falls silent, while he stares at the boy, who's casually asking for money. He then asks if Chang Mayong came alone, to which he replies yes. The man questions if that means there's no one else besides him. The boy says yes again. He looks at the servant beside him, who shrugs, unsure of what to do. Looking at the boy, he wonders if Manhwa is playing a joke on the Enro trading company. However, maybe the boy really had a solution. That's when Mok-sung starts laughing and says that there's no way this sect could be more ridiculous than this. He approaches the vice president and says he warned him that it was a waste of time to talk with Manhwa. They don't have the necessary knowledge to take care of his father and sent this joke of a person here. He at least thought that the leader of Manhwa was a wise old man. So why did he pull such a cheap trick like this? Chang Mayong thinks that he should have imagined something like this would happen, considering his age. So he decides that he'll have to convince them somehow. He leans in and says he'll introduce himself. His name is Chang Mayong, and he's a third-class disciple of Manhwa. They had recently received the letter sent by the vice president, and he's there because he believes he knows the reason for the symptoms his father is experiencing. The vice president seems startled by the boy's statement. He asks if he really has knowledge of what's happening, to which the boy confirms. It was the first time Jongwei had heard someone speak with such confidence. He had already invited countless physicians and martial artists, and no one had the courage to say something like that. Maybe the boy really knew something. However, the leader of the southern sect steps forward and says the boy is far too young to be pulling off such a fraud. He tells the vice president to go inside because they had enough of this nonsense. However, someone then asks for permission to speak. With his hand on his back, the boy asks the old man who he thinks he is to be talking to him like that. Man, a breeze blows through everyone's clothes. Confused, Mok-sung asks if he's talking to him. The boy questions if there was someone else swearing at him at that moment. The old man immediately yells, asking what insolence this is and if he doesn't recognize the southern sect's uniform. The boy says that now it makes even less sense since he thought the man with all his arrogance must be some kind of doctor, which based on all that confidence, he presumes the man has a solution to the boy's father's illness. Mok-sung stares at the boy and remains silent for a moment. Then he says that Master Huan became ill because he strayed from the virtuous path, and the only way to cure this is with a Taoist ritual that will calm the wrath of the heavens. Chang Mayong says that sounds very convincing, but if it were a Taoist ritual, they should have called the Wading sect or the Kunlun sect. After all, that's not the specialty of the Southern Edge sect. Neither Mount Hua nor the Southern Edge sect should be performing such a ritual. He turns to Jongwei and asks if he doesn't agree that his father should be treated by an expert. Jongwei is left speechless by the boy's knowledge. And Mok-sung immediately gets in the boy's face, asking how he dares to speak like that to an elder of a sect. However, Chang Mayong doesn't seem to care, and the old man is seething with rage. He then asks the vice president if he's just going to stand there and do nothing, not expelling this child immediately. But he remains silent. Then he tells Mok-sung that this is not the Southern sect, as he is merely a guest of the Enro trading company. In that place, he decides how guests are treated. He addresses the boy as young master and asks if he could answer a few questions. The boy agrees, and he then asks him to explain more about these symptoms he claims to recognize. Chang Mayong says he heard that Master Huang often travels for business, and he believes that on one of those trips, he passed through the mountain of my feet and was contaminated there. Immediately, Jongwei is startled by the fact that this didn't happen at all. The boy is confused and asks if he's sure his father didn't pass through there. The boy asks that his father was attacked by bandits, and Jongwei says that nothing has happened in the last 5 years. Chang Mayong is completely confused, asking where exactly the old man got beaten up. However, for the son, the little hope he had vanished. Mok-sung begins to laugh at the skies, saying he told them it was a waste of time. Mount Hua was full of bandits, and they were only there to steal money from the innocent. Clearly, that insolent child wasn't there to do any good. Jongwei then asks the young master to consider the position he's in. He understands that maybe the boy believes he can help his father, but doing something wrong would only worsen his condition. It was a pity, but he would have to ask the boy to leave. However, he would send a word of thanks to the sect master who sent him. The door was closing, but the boy holds it open. He then says that the old man's skin must be turning red and his body cold as ice. Jongui realizes that he knows something. Kyan Mayon explains that if you run your finger over the palm, it starts to change color. Also, before falling into a coma, he must have experienced a lot of chills, and some black marks appeared on the back of his neck in between his eyebrows. Jongui immediately pulls the door open and asks how he knows that. Our boy smiles and asks if he can continue. He feels proud as the man tells him to come in, apologizing. However, Mokshung wants to know why he's allowing a Charlin to do something like this. That information wouldn't help at all, but Jongui asks if he knows anything about it, because apparently, he had no way to cure his father. Mokshung is left speechless, and Jongui says it ends here. He no longer wanted the involvement of the Southern Sect in his father's recovery, and if he insisted, a letter would be sent directly to the official of the Southern Sect. Jongui stands there with a sly smile. With that, Mokshung leaves. A little later, the boy pulls back the blanket and sees the old man all red and in terrible shape. Even for him, the condition was much worse than he imagined. He already suspected it was this illness, but not that it had progressed so much. It would be extremely difficult for an old man to survive a year with this disease. He then takes his wrist and begins to use his energy. It travels through the arm, and the boy realizes it was the work of an amateur. Jongui then asks if there's no way to save his father. The boy says that curing him wouldn't be that difficult. Poor Jongui was so disillusioned that he thought the boy said there was no solution. Then he snaps back to reality and realizes the boy said it wouldn't be difficult. And the boy repeats himself to make sure he understands. At that moment, he had delayed the symptoms, so at least his father was no longer in immediate danger of death. In an instant, the black mark on his forehead disappears. Jongui is in disbelief, but the boy says he will need some preparations to cure everything. The son immediately asks what those preparations are. The boy says that first, he wants a nice breakfast. A while later, he's already eaten a lot, and Jongui is still asking what the real preparations are. The boy keeps eating, saying it's nothing special. It was a treatment that required a lot of energy, so he needed to eat plenty before performing it. And indeed, the cook at that place was very talented. Jongui was starting to question whether he could really trust this kid. But after seeing what he did, he could only put his faith in him. Then our boy says that actually his father's condition isn't even the biggest problem. The real question is why he got sick in the first place. And to find that out, he needs a few things to be answered. He then asks who the person closest to his father is. Of all those who serve or accompany him on his travels, who is the person that never leaves his side? Jongui asks why he wants to know. The boy simply says it's related to the treatment. Jongui says that aside from himself, it's hard to be certain, since his father has several assistants and servants. There are at least 5 people who fit that description. Jongui then says that it won't be so easy to find out. Jongui is confused and wants to know why this matters. Our boy then says that he thinks Jongui must have already imagined it. The condition his father is in indicates that he wasn't attacked by a stranger. In other words, someone close to him poisoned him. Immediately, Jongui stands up and says he won't allow such slander. At the Anna Trading Company, they were like family, and everyone respected his father. The boy simply says that maybe he's right, which means if his judgment is wrong, he'll just feel relieved. He picks his teeth, telling him not to worry that the investigation will reveal everything. His theory is that someone with very limited abilities was placing demonic Kai into the old man day by day, little by little. At first, it had no effect until the necessary amount accumulated, and then he started to worsen. Jongui asks how he plans to conduct such an investigation. Our boy says he's just going to ask a few people and the vice president can stand by and watch. But he guarantees things will get very interesting very soon. He then changes his mind and says there's actually one little thing he can do. With his hand on his chest, Jongui says to just ask. The boy grabs the bottle and says he wants another bottle of Yantai liquor. The scene shifts to Mokshung. The old man is even breaking his chopsticks out of anger. He says he's encountered a Dan Brad who carries the same name as that other Dan one. The former, known as the master of the fluorescent blade. The boy talking to him is Isong Beck, who asks if he's referring to the former legendary swordsman. The old man slams the table, asking what's this business about legendary. He says you can't use a title like that for that damned bandit. Isong Beck knows that Mokshung always gets irritated at any mention of Manhwa. It's been 100 years since the master of the fluorescent blade died and still people talk about him. This makes him wonder if the guy was really as strong as the legends say. So he tells Mokshung to pay no attention to this kid. However, Mokshung responds that it's impossible to forget that Dan boy who kept making false promises. Isong Beck simply says the boy is bluffing, so nothing will come of it. But Mokshung has already heard that Master Huang's condition has improved. That's when Isong Beck understands the elder's concern. Huang never forgets a favor, and that means if the boy helps him, all of Mount Hua will be helped. And that was something they from the Southern Edge sect couldn't let happen. He then tells the elder that if he wants, they can make the boy leave the city. It would be wrong for the elder himself to expel the boy, but second-class disciples wouldn't have any problem with it. Besides, no one would think much of a little fight between the people of the Southern Sect and Mount Hua. The elder says they could be accused of beating up a little kid from Mount Hua, But Isong Bake says that everyone already knows about the rivalry between the two sects, so it wouldn't be that strange. They could ask for a small friendly duel, and maybe things would go wrong. This was the perfect chance, especially since the tournament between the Southern Sect and Manhwa was approaching. Moksung slams the table and says he understands the logic, but cannot allow something like that to happen. The boy was just a third-class disciple, and it would be a disgrace for the Southern Sect to challenge someone like him. What would the rest of the world think if they saw them harming a child from a fallen sect? Isong Bak says, "All right then, if the master says so, I'll understand that I don't have permission." He stands up and says that if any of the disciples foolishly lay a hand on the boy, they'll receive the proper punishment. Moksung agrees, saying that you will certainly punish anyone who lays a finger on the boy. However, Isong Bake isn't stupid, and he already knows this is all just a pretense. The reward for whoever does it will be far greater than any punishment. The two then leave. Moksung keeps thinking that it's no surprise to him that young people these days don't respect Manhwa. After all, by the time they were born, the place was already in ruins. But when he was an apprentice, the Southern Sect had no chance of fighting Manhwa head-on. If the strength of that place hadn't been destroyed by the demonic cult, even now, 100 years later, the Southern Sect would still be beneath them. And obviously, they cannot go back to those days in any way. One thing is certain. If they sent that boy from so far away, they are trying to influence the world again. To him, that sect was impossible to recover. However, it seems he will have to speak with the Southern Edge leader once this is resolved. The scene shifts to two guys outside. Goe asks Izong what he plans to do with the kid. He replies that he'll politely ask him to leave the city. It's not in his nature to pick fights with a child, but he also can't allow him to cause trouble for the elder. What he finds strange is why Manhwa sent a child like this, as at that age, they shouldn't even be allowed to leave the sect. Apparently, the sect had fallen so much that they no longer had rules. Suddenly, Isong stops and says, "Speak of the devil," as someone matching the description was right in front of them. Our boy was there, whistling casually until someone called out to him. They approach and say it's an honor to meet a disciple of Manhwa. Then he introduces himself as Isong Bake, a disciple of the Southern Edge. Clearly, our boy doesn't care at all about that. Isong then asks where he's going. Our boy says he's going to see Master Kwang. He's curious to know if his condition has improved. Isong thinks the kid is shameless. What was that child thinking of doing when none of the best doctors had found the solution? He then asked our boy if he has a minute. Isong wants to know what it is, and the boy says he won't beat around the bush. As everyone knows, the Southern Sect and Manhwa have always competed with each other, and the big challenge is coming. Kang Mayong, however, says he's never heard of that since he's just recently joined the sect. Isong thinks, now it's explained. It's because he doesn't know about this enmity that he has the courage to be so brazen. He then says that experiencing the martial arts of Manhwa firsthand would be extremely valuable for his training, and he asks what the boy thinks about that. Could the boy demonstrate Manhwa's famous swordsmanship? Isong is sure the boy will refuse. As brazen as the boy is, he would realize he doesn't stand a chance and would end up getting beaten. However, our boy, straight-faced like Lloyd Frontier, asks if he wants a fight. Isong is thrown off by the audacity of the damn cheeky kid. He tries to explain that it's not a fight, but rather a friendly contest. However, our boy says that from what he understood, the guy wants a fight. Unfortunately for him, the boy never turns down a fight, but he has to remember that he was the one who asked for it. Sometime later, they are facing each other in the arena. Isong asks for his Taoist name. Our boy says he doesn't have one, but that his real name is Tong Mayong. Isong says he understands. He addresses the young master and says he's going to give him some advice. Even though he may not know his actions were wrong, he's still guilty for what he's done. That's why he advises him to return to Manhwa before he gets hurt. But our boy interrupts and asks if they're not going to fight already. Apparently, the Southern Sect folks like to argue with words since they're in the arena and still talking. Goe on the side is eager to jump in and beat up the boy too. But Isong just raises his arm. He starts talking to himself, saying he needs to learn more about self-discipline. Because at that moment, all he could think about was how to beat up that boy. But he wasn't wrong. There was no reason to hold back. He stretches out his hand, telling himself it's time to end this. He introduces himself once again and says he requests a duel with the disciple of Manhwa. But the boy tells him to wait a moment. Isong asks why. At that moment, our boy calls the guy behind him, who looks a bit confused. He stretches out his hand and then asks to borrow his sword. The two are left thinking that poverty had really hit Manhwa. How could someone from a sword sect not have a sword? The guy asks where his sword is, and our boy says he didn't come here to fight, so he didn't bring it. He then starts looking around and says, "All right, I'll grab a stick from around here." But Isong tells Goe to hand over the sword. That's because it would be shameful if word got out that the Southern Sect people beat up a boy who wasn't even armed. At that moment, our boy looks back and the sword falls into his hand. He slings it over his shoulder and says it's time to start. Isong asks if he's not going to draw the sword from its sheath, and our boy says he doesn't want to kill him. Poor Isong is losing his patience. He says that every time this damn boy speaks, he forgets the inner peace he's been cultivating. He's certain the boy won't change unless he inflicts some serious damage. He then tells Chong Mayong that he's going to take this seriously because when he regrets it, it will be too late. Our boy tells him to come on because he doesn't have all day. Isung then assumes his stance and jumps toward the boy, tearing up the entire floor. Our boy was just watching as Isung came in for a strike, but he simply places the blade alongside his arm and defends himself. However, the boy lost his balance. At that moment, Isung steps on the ground again and jumps toward him. Our boy ends up having to defend himself. He's confused because it's more difficult than he expected. Smoke is rising in the arena, and Gowi notices that Isung is really angry. He doesn't know how this fight will end in a friendly way, but that kid kind of deserved it for provoking them so much. To him, the boy should just give up already since he's at least holding out a little bit. After all, by now, he must be reaching his limit. He's sure Isung could finish it whenever he wants. But then there would be the rumor they beat up a child. That's why he's holding back his attacks so the boy can survive. It was truly generous of the young master. Once again, Isung comes in for an attack and is startled. The area explodes and the boy is thrown backward. Isung is already exhausted, confused as to how this kid blocked again. He can't understand how this boy, who moves like a snail, has been blocking all his attacks. That's when he starts to realize something. The boy was positioning his sword to defend long before his attack arrived. It was as if he already knew every move, which would be impossible unless he could read minds. By his appearance, he must be around 15 years old, younger than his own younger brother. He thinks again and says now he wants to see him block this. He goes for an overhead slash, but the boy calmly slides his foot to the side, places his sword, and deflects the attack. Isung realizes once again that the boy doesn't seem to be exerting much effort, which is strange because Isung is considered one of the prodigies of the Southern Edge sect. Now he was starting to lose his temper. His hand begins to turn blue and a gust of wind forms around him. He starts repeating to himself that this shouldn't be possible. Then he tells the boy that this sword is going to cut the heavens in two. He leaps toward him, activating the sky-splitting technique, but Golwei yells at him to be careful or he'll kill the boy. At the last second, it seems like Isung starts to hold back the move. However, the moment his sword touches Chang Wyong's, nothing happens. Isung feels relieved because if he had used his full strength, he would have been in trouble. But then the boy is thrown far away. Man, the boy spits blood. The two are shocked as the boy's body falls to the ground. The wall is destroyed and the boy is half dead. Confused, Isung doesn't know what happened. He stands there frozen until Golwei yells his name and runs over, asking what he did to a child. Isung tries to explain, saying it wasn't intentional, but he sees Golwei picking up the boy, who looks unconscious. But he's certain that at the moment of the attack he had withdrawn his ki. He touched the sword and suddenly the boy was thrown far away. The boy, however, coughs and spits out a sea of blood. Golwei is shocked, asking what they're going to do now. Poor Isung didn't even know a human could hold that much blood. Now he's sure he's going to look like a villain in this situation. Then someone approaches and asks what all this is about. The boys are startled. It's John Wee asking what the Southern Sect people had done. One of the doctors approaches and says the boy is in terrible shape. They need to move him right away. With that, he's thrown over one of the men's shoulders and taken away. Isung knows it'll be hard to come up with an excuse for this situation. Not even the legendary strategist could come up with a decent excuse. Then John Wee asks why they, who claim to belong to such a great sect, use such a deadly move on a child. He really thought the Southern Edge sect was a virtuous place. But now he would only question those words after witnessing such senseless violence. He turns to Isung and says he won't forget what happened there. The boy tries to explain, but Jongwei immediately tells them to leave the Unha Trading Company. Then someone else arrives asking what the commotion was about. It's Moksham asking the vice president what happened. Then he notices his sword, a pool of blood, and the destroyed wall. Immediately, he knows those idiots did something stupid. He then tells the vice president that it seems there's been an accident, but the vice president asks if they have the nerve to call that an accident. The boy who was treating his father was almost cold-bloodedly murdered by the Southern Sect's disciples. Accident was not the right word to use when it was clearly intentional. Isung tries to explain, saying he didn't use excessive force, but Jongwei tells him to stop interrupting and get out of that place. It was ridiculous for him to use the excuse of a casual sparring match when the result looked like a battlefield. And how could it be fair for him to fight a child who was nearly half his age? Was that the virtue the Southern Edge sect stood for? He then says he said enough. It's time to gather the disciples and leave the Unha Trading Company. Moksham remains silent. Then he says they will do as asked. He apologizes for what happened, but says that the Southern Edge sect wishes the best for Master Kwon. The vice president passes by and says he will remember. However, to say that everyone in the Southern Edge sect wants something like this would be an exaggeration. Moksham has to stay quiet. Golwei stands there, and Isung hangs his head low. He's about to apologize, but Moksham tells Golwei to return to the sect, and he warns Isung that since he made this mess, he'll stay until they regain the vice president's favor. Poor Isung stays silent, biting his tongue, but he has no choice but to say he understands. Later in the room, the doctor says the boy is in critical condition. They could use all kinds of treatments, but there was no guarantee he would recover 100%. Jongwei asks if at least the boy's life is not in danger, and the man says yes. He then feels relieved. He asks when the boy will recover, and the man says maybe in about 3 days. Jongwei relaxes. Looking at the boy, he couldn't have imagined that the only hope of curing his father was now unconscious. This child was the only person who managed to improve his father's condition, even if just a little. He knows that, in the end, this boy is his only chance to save his father's life, and to think that he would be beaten to the point of losing consciousness. Anyone who respected the honor of the trading company would never do such a thing. The Southern Edge sect had become far too arrogant. The doctor then asks if he is sure the boy can really cure his father. To him, it was hard to believe. However, Jongwei explains that many renowned doctors came there and did nothing. But the boy was able to describe the entire illness without even seeing it. Not to mention, he saw the boy improve his father's health right in front of his eyes. He wasn't trusting the boy blindly, but because he's sure the boy was sent by the heavens. That's why they must ensure by any means that he recovers as best as possible. Night falls. Someone opens the door and enters the room. A man in a cloak stares at Chong Mayong's sleeping body. He prepares an attack and says he personally has nothing against the boy, but this is the price he has to pay for getting in their way. He raises his hand and strikes at the boy's neck, or rather right beside his head, because Chong Mayong wakes up and dodges. With a smile, he grabs the man's arm. He stands up and says, "Found you." Our boy is already laughing, asking if the cat got his tongue. The man activates the power in his other hand and attacks, but Chong Mayong easily dodges again, steps on his back, and lands on the other side. But the attacker notices and throws an explosion. However, the boy dodges again. The persistent assassin activates another attack in his hand, saying that now he'll finish him since there's no escape in midair. He sends a palm strike, but our boy kicks his attack away. The man is left speechless as Chong Mayong lands on the ground, saying he must be pretty confused, and then tells him he wasn't the one trapped. At that moment, someone enters and the man turns to the side. Jongwei and several guards are watching this. Chong Mayong says he's fallen right into the trap. Jongwei demands an explanation for what the man was doing there. It's Jabok Bian, one of his father's servants. The protagonist picks something up from the ground and says, "I told you so." He goes to the president's residence and says the person has revealed himself. Jongwei says he didn't want to believe it, but seeing this, it was impossible to deny. To think that his father's most trusted advisor was behind all of this. Jabok asks how they knew it was him. But our boy simply says he had no idea. He just made sure everyone believed he could cure Master Huang, and then got himself hurt to make himself vulnerable. Confused, Jabok asks what he would have done if he hadn't shown up. But Chong Mayong replies that he had no choice. If he died that night, all the blame would fall on the Southern Edge sect. Jabok says, "So you're plotting with those bastards?" But our boy just says he's wrong again. He would have found another way to get hurt, but luckily, they called him for that duel. Jabok says he heard the boy had internal injuries and was in critical condition. But our boy just says tricking a local doctor isn't that hard. Then he says Jabok seems to have a lot of questions, but they're not there to satisfy his curiosity. All he needs to know is that he fell into the trap and was caught as someone trying to kill Master Huang. Jabok stops and starts laughing at the sky. Everyone is confused by the madman's laughter. He asks how his attempt to kill the boy would show that he wanted to kill Master Huang. Zhongli asks, confused, what he's talking about. Jabok says Master Huang means the world to him. The vice president asks then why was he trying to kill the boy? The assassin responds that he's sure the boy is trying to deceive everyone there. Even the masters couldn't cure the old man, so how could this boy do anything? Zhongwei, however, says if he really had doubts, he would try to convince him, not kill him. But Jabok retorts, saying the vice president has lost touch with reality and wouldn't believe him. Killing the boy was the only way to make him wake up to the truth. Our boy says all of this is just a bunch of blah, 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 and asks if he really has to listen to such pathetic excuses. He then starts to approach. He activates his aura in his fist and heads toward Jabok, saying it's time to end this. Jabok counters with an aura slash, but our boy throws his arm into the slash, which hits his hand. He then falls to the ground and raises his arm, telling everyone to pay attention. His hand had the same color as the old man's with the curse. He then says that the technique is called the Crimson Demon Hand. Being poisoned by someone with full control over this technique would end anyone's life. Jabok's attack wasn't enough to kill him, but an ordinary person would certainly die. For anyone trained, slowly poisoning the old man without him noticing would be child's play. And Jabok was the only person who stayed by the old man's side all the time and had mastery of this technique. At that moment, John Wee yells to have him arrested. The men move in, and he says to use maximum force if necessary. Angry, Jabok says that his work was almost complete, but now everything had gone wrong because of a damn child. Meanwhile, nearby, Aisong is on some stairs. He remembers Muksung saying that since he made the mess, he would have to fix it. He knows very well that this is his punishment for everything he did. But at that moment, an explosion happens nearby. He's confused. It was Jabok using a demon palm strike. Chong Mayong says that Jabok is forcing him to get involved. He tells him to stop making excuses, because there will be time for that when he's in prison. All Jabok has to do now is take a little beating and pass out. But Jabok calls him insolent for thinking he's going to win this. However, our boy just says that, actually, he's out of this now. He looks to the side and says help is coming. He then calls for Chong Mayong and says that a great hero from the Southern Sect had arrived to save the day. Chang Mayong is a bit confused, but our boy tells him to be the hero already. Chang Mayong points to himself, wondering if they're talking about him. Our boy points with his mouth, telling him to look to the side. He sees Zhonghui's face and understands. That was the perfect opportunity for him to fix the mess he had made. If that's the case, he can't lose this chance and immediately jumps into action. He yells at Jebok to prepare to be punished by the sword of the Southern Sect. With that, he starts exchanging blows with Jebok. Our boy already celebrates, saying, "Finally, it's over." But Zhonghui says they're still fighting, as far as he can see. However, Chang Mayong says it's impossible for a rookie to defeat someone who has been training for so long in the Southern Sect. Zhonghui says it's impossible since Jebok orchestrated the whole plan. But our boy says he just lowered his kai to curse his hand and show everyone. However, it's clear that Jebok's mastery is very low. Zhonghui says it seems Chang Mayong really is a martial arts master. The boy cheekily says, "Of course, and besides, I'm the most experienced of all the masters in the world." A little while later, he's sitting on the stairs yawning while the fight continues inside. He says it's been going on for an hour, and that he should have handled it himself. Finally, Jebok's body falls to the ground. Aisung is exhausted, but Seaver says that Baster has been defeated. Zhonghui thanks him and says he'll never forget the Southern Sect's help in this matter. With that, the boy collapses to the ground, expressing his gratitude. Our boy comes in, saying, "Finally." Meanwhile, Zhonghui can't understand what just happened. The problems that had plagued the place for the past year were resolved in 2 days by this boy. He can't understand if it was really that simple. Or rather, it was impossible to say it was simple since no one realized there was an infiltrator. To Zhonghui, it felt like some kind of veteran resided in the body of that young boy. He then asked Chang Mayong how he knew Bion was trying to harm his father, or at least why he thought Bion wanted his father dead. Our boy just says he has no idea. But the vice president says he orchestrated the whole plan, so he must have something in mind. But with a sly smile, Chang Mayong says he has no clue, he's just here for the reward. And obviously he knows that this merchant group is quite honest, so they won't try to bargain. But then Zhonghui says he forgot one small detail. The reward wasn't for catching the villain, but for helping his father recover, who was still sick. He wants to know if Chang Mayong can actually do that. Our boy smiles and says, "Of course." Zhonghui then says that if that's the case, he'll guarantee a reward for Manhwa, even if it costs the entire trading company. Our boy is shocked and grabs his hand. Zhonghui says there's no need to get so emotional. But the protagonist asks if he's joking. The old man is confused, and our boy starts complaining, saying that the reward is his, not the sect's. He came here, worked hard, so why would Mount Hua get the reward? Zhonghui thinks this boy is stranger than he imagined. A little later, our boy knows that now he just has to cure the master. The plan has been perfect so far, and he had fun humiliating the Southern Sect. But the real problem is just about to begin. He's not 100% confident that he can actually cure such an advanced illness. Of course, to convince them, he said he could, but he's not entirely sure. That's because the body he's in now isn't the body of the master of the fluorescent blade. If the demonic key starts attacking the old man's body during the process, he might die in that state. But he has no choice but to try something. He asks Master Huang not to hate him if everything goes wrong. Energy then starts to flow through his arm. He creates a small Chang Mayong made of floating energy. Our boy now faces the demonic Kai directly. Thousands of snakes were circling the old man's body. Even though it was demonic energy from a novice, it had been applied all over the body, and he doesn't know if the energy he possesses will be enough to eliminate it. The snakes advance, and he says he has no choice but to try. With that, he begins slicing through the demonic Kai. Outside, little by little, the arm is being purified, and then he gets confused by something. The single attack he made created a rupture in the middle of the demonic Kai. He starts feeling confident that maybe he can do it. That's because his current body only contains the purest ki anyone can carry. If he had accepted any other energy, he would have at least 10 times more now. But it's exactly because he only possesses pure energy that it's so easy to combat the demonic one. Now the only problem was whether Master Huang could survive this internal battle. He continues attacking and dissipating all the ki, while begging the old man to hold on just a little longer. He was almost done with the job. He delivers one more attack, but then something unexpected happens. The snakes begin to flee from him. He wonders where they are going. When he opens his eyes, he sees the old man's body. The demonic Kai had all gathered in his head. Trying to cure the old man's head directly was much more risky. However, leaving him in this state wasn't a good option either. If he presses forward, the old man might die, but if he backs off, he will definitely die. The decision wasn't easy, but it had to be made. If these were the choices, he would take the direct route. With that, the spiritual energy moves directly toward the old man's head. However, what he does is use his own body to start pulling the energy into himself. His hand turns red and his entire body starts to crack. He pulled in too much demonic energy. He collapses to his knees, saying not to underestimate him. A master of the fluorescent blade couldn't die to something as idiotic as this. But his vision starts to blur. His consciousness begins to fade and he clenches his fist, saying he won't pass out there. If he blacks out with all that ki floating in his body, he'll die for sure. Especially considering that a child's body is much more vulnerable. He assumes his spiritual form within his own body, looks at the demonic key, and tells it to come at him. The snakes attack once again, but he dodges, steps on them, and starts walking toward them. One slash, and he opens a rift through the middle of them. But once again, they come in to bite him and manage to trap him. But the head is dislodged, and he appears from within. However, he starts to wonder what's happening. The demonic Kai in his body was moving much faster. He slashes another one, but realizes he can't keep track of their movements. That's when a horde manages to attack him again. Another flash of light, and he shreds the lot of them. Something had changed. The demonic Kai seemed to be getting aggressive because it knew it was being cornered. And now the fact that he had little energy left was a problem. Because this battle dragged on, he wouldn't stand a chance. The curse was starting to take over his body. He leaps to dodge another attack, but another one comes in midair to grab him. Man, he takes the bite and is carried away. He tightens his grip on the sheath, but at that moment he drops the sword because another snake bites his arm. And another bites his body, and the poor kid is being devoured. Trapped by the bites, he can't do anything. He is then forced to use his last resort, something he wanted to avoid because it would affect his body. He begins to open all the energy points in his body. With that, the aura that had been sealed begins to flow throughout the area. As it fills his entire body, he creates an explosion in every limb. As the energy surged, he was in agony. His body was breaking apart, but the curse was slowly being undone, until finally a demonic key seems to leave him. The poor kid falls to the ground, completely purified. His little body was even emitting smoke. He opens his eyes and grabs his chest in shock. He immediately stands up, saying it was a close call. He almost died this time. He decides he better never try something like that again, since this had way more demonic energy than he could handle. As he thinks how lucky he was, Huang starts to wake up. This catches our boy's attention, and the old man turns his head. He asks who is there. Chang Mayong says, "Finally, you're awake." And when asked who he is, he says, "Let's just say I'm your savior." The old man asks if he has already reached hell. Our boy tells him to stop being rude. After Master Huang regains consciousness, things quickly return to normal at the Unha Trading Company. If Chang Mayong hadn't discovered Jiabok's plans, he would have eventually destroyed the entire family and stolen the company. After much insistence, they discovered that Jiabok owned another trading company, which had gone bankrupt due to Unha's success. However, our boy couldn't care less. Everyone has a sad story, but that doesn't give them the right to become criminals. The only thing he wants to know is how that guy obtained the Crimson Hand. According to the man, he found a fallen body with various scriptures nearby. To Chang Mayong, that was quite anticlimactic. But it was better this way, because if it really was the demon cult, things wouldn't have been so easy. Either way, he cured the master and discovered that the cult wasn't involved, so it was a happy ending. As the savior of the company, he was honored with a banquet. He ate and drank everything he wanted. After all, those guys had a lot of money. While he was happily singing, someone outside said he should rest. It was Master Huang, who said that when he fell asleep, he was in worse shape than now. He enters, asking permission, and inquires if the boy is Master Chang Mayong. Now chubby, Chang Mayong asks if the old man doesn't remember when he woke up. Maybe he had gained a few pounds since that day. Zhang Wei says the boy had eaten his weight in food in just 3 days. The chubby man then asks how he can help, and the old man says he'll get straight to the point. He apologizes for the impertinence, but wanted to ask something of the young master. The old man starts to kneel and then bows, asking if he would please accept his gratitude. It was thanks to the boy that he could still breathe, so he didn't even know how to repay this debt. Still afraid, our boy says there's no need to bow. But the old man replies that he has no idea how he will repay this debt, but he will do the best he can. What he wanted was the opportunity to repay it. And if the boy wanted anything, he should ask without hesitation. However, our boy says that as a follower of the virtuous path, he cannot accept anything for saving a life. Doing so would shame his sect, especially since he is here without Mount Hua's permission. The old man seems a bit confused by this. Our boy simply says that it was such an urgent matter that he couldn't wait for the sect's permission. The old man's eyes light up, asking if he really went that far for him. And he says that if he wanted, they wouldn't tell the sect about this. But chubby man smiles and asks if he's sure they won't tell. The old man says yes, and Chang Mayong immediately pulls out a little notebook from his shirt. Master Huang asks what that is. Our boy says it's just a few notes because at his age, his memory isn't that great. The two are confused by this age talk. Master Huang then asks what the notes are for. Our boy flips through the pages saying, "Didn't you say I could ask for anything?" Then the master starts to understand. That little notebook contained everything the boy wanted, and the chubby man asks if they could start. Sometime later, Jiangmi asks his father how he's feeling. He picks up the cup and says that strangely, his body feels lighter than ever. It's as if he's gotten 10 years younger. Jiangmi says all of this is very strange. But then his father asks if there's something he wants to say. Since his health is better, he knows his son isn't just there to talk about that. The son stays silent for a second. He calls his father and then calls him president. He says he'd heard that he plans to end negotiations with the southern sect, and also promise a great reward to Mount Hua. His father confirms this. Once again, Jiangwei hesitates. He then reminds him that the southern sect is the greatest power among all the sects in Shaanxi. They would be turning their backs on such a powerful group and aligning themselves with Mount Hua, which is basically bankrupt. This would be extremely dangerous, even if it was to show gratitude to that young boy. Analyzing the entire situation, he thinks the reward is a bit excessive. However, if his father insists on doing this, he should at least maintain negotiations with the southern sect. The old man slams the cup on the table and asks what the main role of a merchant is. Zhang is a bit uneasy, searching for the words. Then he says the role of a merchant is to make deals that follow the virtuous path and enrich the local economy, at the same time making a positive contribution to the country and the world. His father spits out his tea and starts laughing. He says that's a very idealistic view for the vice president. But those are just a bunch of pretty words because he already knows the truth. The obligation of a merchant is to make money. They need to seek profit above all else, even if sometimes they have to go against the virtuous path. If a merchant wants to do good, they do it with the money they earn. Because for someone who deals in business, there is no good or evil in money itself. So the concern is only efficiency. Zhang asks if he understands correctly. His father's plan is to make money through the bankrupt Manhwa. But Master Huang asks if he's forgotten how he made the trading company so big. A natural instinct to find opportunities, to see something undervalued with great potential and invest in it before anyone else. Whether it's a martial sect or even another trading company. Zhang knows that's how his father made Manhwa the largest company in Shaanxi. However, he insists, saying he doesn't see why they should invest in Manhwa since it has no potential. But then he thinks of the boy and says it does. He agrees that right now, Manhwa can't compete with the southern sect. But if it continues to grow at the rate he believes it will, they'll only need to maintain a good relationship, and thus they would have an unimaginable return on this investment. However, the son couldn't believe it, saying that this just made him even more confused. If Manhwa didn't thrive, they would lose everything since there was no guarantee it would succeed. But the father said that Zhang was speaking from a place of ignorance. A merchant isn't just someone who bets on the likelihood of things going well. They would make Manhwa succeed. The plan wasn't to wait for the sect to grow on its own. He himself would ensure that Manhwa flourished again. In his life as a merchant, he had met countless people, but none had impressed him as much as that boy. It was as if his whole life he had been looking for something old, and suddenly he was awakened by a dragon. Ordinary people like the two of them had trouble understanding martial artists, but he didn't need to understand and just trust that eventually the truth would reveal itself. If the rewards he gave the boy created a bond, the company would have no choice but to prosper. To him, this was a small price to pay for success in life. Zhang, however, hesitated, asking if it was really such a small price. The old man fell silent and admitted that the boy had taken 5 times more than he had intended to pay. He cursed that the rascal really knew how to negotiate. The son smiled, saying that he didn't know why, but his father's mind was already made up. If that's what he was thinking, he was happy to follow his orders. But he still wasn't completely convinced. That's why he would give his best every day to ensure his doubts vanished from his heart. And personally, he would make sure that Manhwa also followed a path to success. The father observed and said he was pleased to hear that from his son. Back with our boy, Chang Mayong knew that this master had another motive for investing so much. A merchant like that wouldn't give away a fortune just out of gratitude. But he didn't care much about what the merchant expected in return. After all, he could just ignore any request a merchant made. A child might feel indebted, but he was an old man and couldn't care less about that. That's when someone approached the chubby boy. It was Aisong who stopped in front of him. Our boy asked what he was doing there again. However, Aisong pulled out a sword and handed it to him. He told him not to worry, that he had no bad intentions. But if he allowed it, he wanted a rematch. Another duel, but this time a real one. He had realized that he had been used as a tool to reveal that man's true intentions. Our boy said that calling it a trap was a strange way of putting it, since he knew that Aisong was trying to set a trap to get him out of the city. But he was willing to let the past stay in the past. He just wanted to know what that had to do with him fighting again. Aisong explained that he had been humiliated in public, put in mortal danger, and used as a pawn in the boy's plans. But it was his own fault for being deceived. Yet the only thing he kept thinking about was their practice fight before everything happened. What had occurred there still escaped his understanding. Our boy asked if that's why he wanted another fight, and Aisong confirmed it. He admitted he had no idea, but he already knew the boy was much stronger than him. What he wanted was to understand what happened that day. Chang Mayong seemed to like this guy who was asking for another fight, even though he had been humiliated. He thought Aisong wanted to beat him up for everything that had happened, but this was a surprise. He told Aisong to think carefully or he would regret it. But Aisong smiled and said he was sure. The two then faced each other in the arena. Aisong couldn't believe how small the boy was, about 10 years younger than him and at least a level of difference in martial arts. It was as if a second-class disciple could defeat a third-class one. This strange difference made the poor guy tremble and sweat. Even though he was much older, he still felt a sense of oppression. It was as if he were standing in front of one of the elders of his sect. In theory, it should have been impossible for someone so young to have such a powerful aura. But he decided he would have to see for himself. Chang Mayong then said that Aisong was sharp. He hadn't done anything yet to intimidate the guy, but he was already trembling because he could sense his power. Perceiving something like that showed that he actually had a lot of potential. Chang Mayong noted that he could see the boy would have a late start. He knew that the person in front of him was one of those people who would grow infinitely stronger the more they trained. Perhaps in the distant future, he would even become the strongest swordsman of the Southern Sect. And if that was the case, Chang Mayong was willing to teach him a few things. He raised his hand and told him to come. Aisong readied his sword, flicked it to the side, and cracked his neck. Our boy recognized that as an illusion technique, but it wasn't something commonly used in the Southern Sect. Aisong then warned him. He had realized there was no chance. That's why he had to start with the strongest technique he had. Several shadows of his hand began to appear, and he warned Chang Mayong. He was going to use the 12 snow petal strikes technique, but our chubby boy didn't seem happy about it and called him a bastard. Aisong, however, threw himself forward, activating the technique. Our boy watched in anger. Man, he passed through, breaking the sword and sending the guy flying. The boy was left floating in the air. Before he could hit the ground, our boy was already beside him. He grabbed him by the shirt and lifted him up. Cursing him once again, he asked where he had learned that technique. This 12 snow petals thing was pure nonsense. The rest of the world might be fooled, but it wouldn't work on him. That's because this was a technique he knew deeply. It was one of the ancient core techniques of Manhwa, known as the dispersal of petals, a technique that had been lost even within Manhwa itself. So why was this guy from the Southern Sect using something like that? Aisong, barely conscious, muttered that he finally understood. The disparity between him and Chang Mayong was like looking at a ghost. The poor guy started to lose his mind, wondering if this was what death felt like. Sometime later, he opened his eyes. He was in a hospital, battered. He tried to sit up. Chang Mayong told him that his internal injuries were being treated and would heal soon. Aisong still didn't understand anything, but Chang Mayong was already asking about the technique. The 12 snow petal technique. Aisong confirmed that was indeed the name. The protagonist couldn't believe that they had stolen such a technique so blatantly. And worse, nobody in the world, not even within Manhwa, had noticed. That's because no one remembered what the techniques were like back then. He then asked who had taught this technique, and Aisong said any disciple above the second year could learn it. Our boy wanted to know if even the elders were using it. Aisong replied that as far as he knew, the elders hadn't learned it. At the moment, it was only being taught to first and second degree disciples. This caught Chang Mayong's attention. If not all the elders knew this technique, then one of them must be teaching it to the disciples, which confirmed that the bastard who had stolen Mount Hua's techniques was still alive as an elder of the Southern Sect. It was all too obvious what happened. When Mount Hua was invaded by the demon cult, hundreds of members died on the 100-foot mountain, leaving few survivors, most of them children. They had likely received some help. Someone probably appeared, shouting to save the Mount Hua disciples, and the Southern Sect warriors rushed into battle. Chang Mayong had long suspected something like this. After all, it would have been shameful for any martial sect not to help another being attacked by the demon cult. The problem was that under the guise of being allies, some of the tomes had been stolen, and perhaps the rest of the books had not been burned by the demon cult. A century ago, they had sacrificed all their lives to save the land from this great evil, and yet they had been betrayed by those they saved. The most shameful thing was that they had stolen the technique and then given it the name Snow Petal. He stood up and told Aisong that it would be better if he didn't learn that technique. Aisong, confused, asked why. Chang Mayong smacked him on the head and told him not to ask, just to obey. They fell silent, and Chang Mayong explained that it was a technique he would never master. The poor guy was still confused. Our boy was fuming and would have beaten him up more if it weren't for the fact that it was thanks to him that he had discovered all of this. He then explained that the Southern Sect's techniques follow a style that requires staying true to the fundamentals. Because of this, people practicing it must feel like everything is slow and heavy, but it was a type of study that became infinitely stronger the more time you dedicated to it. However, this snow petal technique went completely against that philosophy. If Aisong wanted to become a true martial arts master, he would have to abandon that knowledge. A sword strike with so many variations didn't fit the philosophy of the Southern Sect. He asked if Aisong understood and stared at him, but the poor guy was too clueless and still confused. Our boy was furious that he had to teach the philosophy of the guy's own sect to him. But then he began to wonder why these idiots had started to create a variation they couldn't even master. That's when he stopped to think. Maybe he was the reason they had gone so far. At least that's the thought that crossed his mind. That's because, in the past, he used to go around the city beating up all the disciples of the Southern Sect. Surely the members there had taken great pride in the techniques they had learned, until he showed up and started beating everyone down. Perhaps this had led to doubts about their own techniques. What they didn't understand was that martial power isn't determined by the strength of the techniques, but by the skill of the individual. The strangest part was that they might not even have realized they were using a Mount Hua style. Aisong stared at his own hand, thinking about this philosophy of his sect. But then our boy turned around, saying he was leaving. Aisong called after him, but our boy told him to forget everything he had said. The path he should follow couldn't be determined by anyone else. The advice he gave might have been useful, but he was still the one who would make his own decisions. That's why he had to stop and think for himself about the path he wanted to follow. At that moment, Aisong stood up and thanked him for the wisdom he had shared. Our boy turned around, smiling, and with that, the chubby guy left. He stood there, saying that this was very strange. It was almost as if he had met an old sage. But outside, our boy was already thinking about going to the southern sect and beating everyone up. He looked up at the sky, talking to his brother Jamu, saying those bastards had stolen everything, so how could he have self-control? If he were as strong as he used to be, he would already be in the middle of the sect. But that wouldn't work now. First, he needed to get stronger as quickly as possible, because the martial world is ruled by strength, and those bastards had messed with the wrong person. Meanwhile, back at Manhwa, someone was tapping their feet, saying that maybe he had been robbed or killed. It was Yunjong who said that since Chao Mayang had been gone for 7 days, something urgent must have happened. Jewel said he hoped it was urgent enough that everyone would forgive him. Apparently, Jewel had been called again by the leader, and he hoped they weren't in trouble. Unjin was listening to someone shouting that the boy was very insolent. It was Hyang Yang who said the brat had disappeared for 7 days and he was just a third-class disciple. He told the leader that this wasn't something that could be overlooked, or how would people respect the sect. Sang told him to calm down, saying that maybe it was an accident. But Hyang Yang said that even if it was an accident, it happened outside the sect and he didn't have permission to leave. His friend insisted, saying maybe he fell in mountains. He turned to the leader and asked if they could send a search team. But the finance guy wanted to know why this third-class disciple had been allowed to roam freely in the first place. Another one banged the table, telling him to stop questioning the leader's decisions. The complaints continued, saying they were pushing the limits and breaking all the rules. The elder stayed silent for a second, then opened his eyes and said, "That's enough." The finance guy was startled and immediately sat down, apologizing. The elder sighed, wondering if he had been wrong to trust that boy. But he found it strange because the boy didn't seem like the type to cause trouble. Unjum stood up and said he would form a group to start searching for him. But then someone shouted that he had returned. Immediately, the elder opened his eyes and asked who. Someone shouted, "The brat." Chang Mayang was approaching the gate. Everyone ran, asking if it was true, and someone confirmed it. The elder rushed out, saying he had to see for himself, but the finance guy told him to wait. The elder asked what was wrong. Hyang Yang said he knew the leader was worried about the boy. That was because, despite being so young, he had helped the sect a lot. The elder told him to get to the point. Hyang Yang then said not to coddle the boy too much, or it could demotivate the other disciples. At Mount Hua, people were raised to follow the virtuous and righteous path. That's why even the most precious disciple needed discipline. The leader sighed in relief, saying he would never forget that. More than anyone, he wanted the boy to have a bright future and be disciplined. But then Unim said that wasn't enough. Disobeying orders was extremely serious, and he should be confined to the cliff cave for at least 6 months. The leader was shocked, saying that he was just a third-class disciple and still didn't know things well. But Yumin insisted that at least a proportionate punishment was necessary. The leader asked if everyone agreed, and all the elders said yes. He calmed down and said, "All right." Manem wondered what the boy had been doing. Finally, our boy entered the gate. As soon as he looked ahead, there were the 5 elders walking toward him. He looked at the leader and greeted him respectfully. The leader observed him and called him over. He immediately asked why he had been gone for so long. Our boy simply replied that it was unavoidable. But Hyang Yang told him to stop being so insolent, as he was just a third-class disciple. No explanation he could give would be satisfactory. The sect master then told him to explain himself but warned him of the punishment. Our boy looked a bit awkward. Then someone asked for permission to enter. The finance guy was startled. It was the people from the Unha Trading Company asking for likes on this video that helps Mamoru make more juicy content for his viewers. Activate the cheeky little bell, and I'm out.